Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Shawnee National Forest, deep in the hollow woods near Garden of the Gods, Illinois, where the ancient sandstone formations cast shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. I should have known something was wrong when Jake suggested we go camping there in the first place. Jake Morrison had been my college roommate and remained my closest friend for over a decade, but he'd been different since his divorce 6 months earlier. Quieter, more intense. He'd developed this obsession with getting back to nature, as he called it, spending weekends alone in remote places I'd never heard of. "You need this, Mike," he'd insisted when I tried to back out. "When's the last time you left the city? Really left it behind?" He wasn't wrong. My marketing job had been consuming me, 60-hour weeks bleeding into sleepless nights, my apartment feeling more like a prison cell with each passing month. The idea of disconnecting completely, of breathing air that hadn't been filtered through concrete and steel, held an undeniable appeal. Sarah Mitchell, my girlfriend of 2 years, had encouraged me to go. "You've been wound so tight lately," she'd said, running her fingers through my hair. "Maybe some time with Jake in the woods will help you remember who you are." That was 3 days ago. Now, as I write this by the dying light of our campfire, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold the pen, I wish I'd listened to the voice in my head that had whispered warnings I'd chosen to ignore. We'd driven down from Chicago on Thursday morning. Jake's Jeep loaded with enough supplies for a week-long expedition, though we'd only planned to stay until Sunday. The drive should have taken 4 hours, but Jake kept making detours, following back roads that seemed to lead nowhere, consulting a hand-drawn map I'd never seen before. "Where'd you get that?" I'd asked, nodding at the yellowed paper covered in symbols I didn't recognize. "Local guy gave it to me last time I was down here," Jake had replied, not taking his eyes off the winding road. "Said it shows places the Park Service doesn't want people to find." The first red flag should have been how Jake had known exactly where to turn off the main forest road, following a barely visible trail that my GPS insisted didn't exist. The second should have been the way he'd smiled when I mentioned my phone had lost signal completely. "Perfect," he'd said. "No distractions." We'd hiked for 3 hours before Jake declared we'd found our spot, a clearing surrounded by towering oak and hickory trees, their branches so thick overhead they blocked out most of the afternoon sun. In the center stood a circle of blackened stones, clearly the remains of previous campfires, though something about the arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Someone's been here before," I'd observed, dropping my pack near the stone circle. "Of course they have," Jake had replied, already beginning to set up his tent. "People have been coming to these woods for centuries. Long before the Park Service, long before the settlers. The Cherokee used to consider this place sacred." "Sacred? How?" Jake had paused in his work, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Sacred in the way that demands respect." That first night had been uneventful, or so I'd thought at the time. We'd cooked over the fire, shared a bottle of whiskey Jake had brought, and talked about old times. But looking back, I realized Jake had been watching the tree line constantly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond our small circle of light with an intensity that seemed to go beyond normal caution. I'd slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of being watched, of shapes moving just outside my vision. I'd attributed it to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest, the way branches creaked and small animals rustled through the underbrush. City living had made me soft, I'd told myself. This was natural. Friday morning brought our first real indication that something was fundamentally wrong. I'd awakened to find our fire had burned out completely, despite Jake banking it carefully before we'd turned in. More disturbing was the fact that the ashes were cold, as if the fire had been extinguished hours ago, Yet I could have sworn I'd heard the crackling of flames throughout the night. Weird, Jake had muttered, examining the cold ashes, but his tone suggested he wasn't surprised. "Did you hear anything last night?" I'd asked while brewing coffee on our camp stove. "Like what?" "I don't know. Movement. Maybe someone walking around the campsite." Jake had been quiet for a long moment, stirring the fire back to life with practiced ease. "The woods are full of sounds, Mike. You'll get used to it." But I wasn't sure I wanted to get used to it. There had been something distinctly human about the sounds I'd heard, footsteps that seemed to circle our campsite in a deliberate pattern. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation was making me paranoid. We'd spent Friday exploring the area, Jake leading me along trails that weren't marked on any map, deeper into the forest than I was comfortable going. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy so thick that walking beneath them felt like moving through a natural cathedral, one dedicated to something far older and more primal than any human god. "This place gives me the creeps," I'd admitted as we'd paused beside a stream that ran black despite the clear water. "That's just your city instincts," Jake had replied. "You're not used to real wilderness, places where humans aren't in control." "Is that what this is about? Proving something?" Jake had turned to face me then, and for a moment I'd seen something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a kind of fervent intensity that bordered on obsession. "This is about remembering what we really are, Mike. Beneath all the civilization, all the technology, all the lies we tell ourselves about being evolved, this is about truth." I'd wanted to ask what truth he was talking about, but something in his tone had warned me off. Jake had always been prone to philosophical tangents, especially when he'd been drinking, but this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. That evening, as we'd sat around the fire sharing another meal, I'd noticed that Jake kept glancing at his watch. Not the digital sports watch I'd expected him to wear camping, but an old pocket watch I'd never seen before, its brass surface tarnished with age. "Nice watch," I'd commented. "Where'd you get it?" "Family heirloom," Jake had replied, snapping it shut and tucking it back into his pocket. "Belonged to my great-grandfather." "I didn't know you had any family heirlooms." "There's a lot you don't know about my family. Mike." The way he'd said it had sent a chill down my spine, but before I could pursue the subject further, we'd been interrupted by a sound from the forest that had made both of us freeze. It had started as a low humming, almost musical, drifting through the trees from multiple directions at once. Not quite human, but not entirely animal either. The sound had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees in a way that made it impossible to determine its source. "What the hell is that?" I'd whispered. Jake had been perfectly still, listening with an intensity that suggested he'd been expecting this. "Probably just wind through the trees," he'd said, but his voice had lacked conviction. The humming had continued for perhaps 10 minutes, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing, before gradually fading away. In the silence that followed, I'd become aware of how quiet the forest had become. No insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush, no night birds calling. Even the stream we'd passed earlier had seemed to stop its babbling. "Jake," I'd said quietly, "I think we should leave." "Leave?" He'd looked at me as if I'd suggested something obscene. "We just got here." "Something's not right about this place. Can't you feel it?" Jake had smiled then, but it hadn't been a pleasant expression. "What I feel is alive, Mike. Really alive, for the first time in months." I'd wanted to argue, to point out that feeling alive shouldn't require venturing into places that felt actively hostile to human presence, but exhaustion had been creeping up on me. The day's hiking, combined with the stress of the strange sounds and Jake's increasingly erratic behavior, had left me drained. "Let's just get some sleep," I'd said. "We can talk about it in the morning." But sleep had been elusive. I'd lain in my sleeping bag, hyper-aware of every sound from outside my tent, convinced that something was moving through our campsite. Several times I'd been certain I'd heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the dying light of our fire. Once, I'd been sure I'd heard someone, or something, unzipping Jake's tent, followed by the soft sound of whispered conversation. I'd called out Jake's name, but received no response. When I'd finally worked up the courage to unzip my own tent and look outside, I'd found Jake's tent empty, its entrance hanging open like a mouth. Panic had flooded through me as I'd grabbed my flashlight and stumbled out into the night, calling Jake's name. My voice had seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, producing no echo, no response. I'd searched the immediate area around our campsite, but the beam of my flashlight had seemed pathetically weak against the oppressive blackness of the forest. I'd been on the verge of panic when Jake had materialized out of the darkness, walking calmly back into the circle of firelight as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" I demanded, relief and anger warring in my voice. "Couldn't sleep," he'd replied with a shrug. "Went for a walk." "A walk? In the middle of the night? In the dark?" "Sometimes you need to embrace the darkness. Mike, let it show you things the light can't." There had been something different about Jake's voice, a quality I couldn't quite identify. When I'd shined my flashlight on his face, looking for some explanation, I'd noticed that his eyes seemed to reflect the light strangely, almost like an animal's. "Are you feeling okay?" I'd asked. "Never better." Jake had smiled, but the expression had seemed wrong somehow, as if he'd forgotten how to arrange his features naturally. "You should try it sometime. Walking in the dark. It's liberating." I'd gone back to my tent, but sleep had been impossible. I'd lain awake until dawn, listening to Jake moving around outside, hearing him speaking in low tones to someone I couldn't see. When I'd finally emerged from my tent Saturday morning, I'd found him sitting by the fire, looking perfectly normal, as if the strange encounter had never happened. "Sleep well?" he'd asked, his voice carrying its usual friendly tone. "Not really. Were you talking to someone last night?" Jake had tilted his head, considering the question with what seemed like genuine confusion. "Talking to someone? Mike, there's nobody else out here. It's just us." But I'd known what I'd heard. Throughout the night, there had been the soft murmur of conversation, Jake's voice mixing with others I couldn't quite make out. When I'd tried to focus on the words, they'd seemed to slip away from me, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Saturday had brought a new set of disturbing developments. Our food supplies, which should have lasted easily through Sunday, had begun to spoil despite being properly stored. The bread had developed patches of green mold overnight, the fruit had turned soft and brown, and the meat we'd brought for dinner had acquired a smell that made my stomach turn. "This doesn't make sense," I'd muttered, examining the ruined food. "It was fine yesterday." "Maybe we should have brought more preservatives," Jake had suggested, but he'd seemed unconcerned by our dwindling supplies. "We need to hike back to the car," I'd said. "Get back to civilization, find a store." "Or we could hunt," Jake had replied casually. "Live off the land for a few days. Really get back to our roots." "Hunt? With what? We didn't bring any weapons." Jake had smiled that unsettling smile again. "There are other ways to hunt, Mike. Older ways." I'd stared at him, trying to understand what he meant, but his expression had given nothing away. Throughout our friendship, Jake had been many things. Impulsive, sometimes reckless, prone to grand gestures and philosophical tangents, but never cryptic, never deliberately unsettling. It was as if someone else was wearing his face, someone who knew enough about Jake to mimic his mannerisms but hadn't quite mastered the subtleties of his personality. That afternoon, Jake had suggested we explore deeper into the forest, following what he claimed was an old Cherokee trail. I'd been reluctant to venture further from our campsite, but Jake had been insistent, almost aggressive in his enthusiasm. "You're being paranoid, Mike," he'd said when I'd voiced my concerns. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that keeps you trapped in that concrete box you call an apartment. Sometimes you have to push past your comfort zone." The trail he'd led me along had been barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path, winding deeper into the forest than I'd thought possible. The trees had grown larger and more ancient as we'd walked, their trunks so massive it would have taken several people holding hands to encircle them. Spanish moss had hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air had grown thick with humidity despite the cool October weather. We'd walked for what felt like hours, Jake consulting his mysterious map at regular intervals before arriving at a clearing unlike anything I'd ever seen. In the center stood a single enormous oak tree, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter, its branches spreading out to form a canopy that blocked out the sky entirely. Around its base, arranged in concentric circles, were dozens of carved stones, each one bearing symbols I didn't recognize. "What is this place?" I'd whispered, though I wasn't sure why I'd felt compelled to lower my voice. "Sacred ground," Jake had replied, his tone reverent. The Cherokee believed this tree was a gateway between worlds, a place where the veil was thin. Gateway to what? Instead of answering, Jake had walked to the base of the tree and placed his palm against the bark. For a moment, nothing had happened. Then the symbols on the surrounding stones had begun to glow with a faint phosphorescence, and I'd heard that humming sound again, stronger now, seeming to emanate from the tree itself. "Jake," I'd said, backing away from the clearing, "we need to leave, now." But when I turned to look at him, Jake had been standing perfectly still, his hand still pressed against the tree bark, his eyes closed. The humming had grown louder, and I'd realized with growing horror that Jake was humming along with it, his voice blending with the otherworldly sound in perfect harmony. "Jake!" I'd shouted, but he hadn't responded. If anything, the humming had grown stronger, and the glow from the stones had intensified. I'd approached him cautiously, reaching out to grab his shoulder, but the moment my hand had made contact with him, I'd been hit by a wave of images that had nearly dropped me to my knees. Visions of ancient rituals, of figures dancing around fires, of sacrifices made to entities that existed in the spaces between reality. And through it all, Jake's face, but not as I knew him. Jake as something else, something older and hungrier. I'd jerked my hand back, gasping, and the visions had stopped. Jake had opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression of mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Ready to head back?" he'd asked conversationally, as if nothing had happened. The walk back to our campsite had passed in silence, but I'd been acutely aware of Jake watching me out of the corner of his eye, as if gauging my reaction to what we'd witnessed. By the time we'd returned to our clearing, the sun had begun to set, painting the forest in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of fire. That evening, as we'd sat around our campfire, I tried to broach the subject of what had happened at the tree. "That place we went today," I'd begun carefully. "Have you been there before?" "Several times," Jake had replied, staring into the flames. "It's peaceful, don't you think?" "Peaceful isn't the word I'd use." Jake had looked at me then, and in the flickering firelight his features had seemed to shift and change, as if I were seeing multiple faces superimposed on one another. "What word would you use, Mike?" "Disturbing, unnatural, wrong." "Wrong according to who? Your suburban sensibilities, your Christian upbringing, your need to categorize everything according to what makes you comfortable?" There had been a bitter edge to Jake's voice that I'd never heard before, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I'd begun to seriously consider the possibility that my oldest friend had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. "Jake, I'm worried about you. This place, whatever it is, it's affecting you. You're not acting like yourself." Jake had laughed, but the sound had been devoid of humor. "Maybe this is who I really am, Mike. Maybe everything else was the act." "What's that supposed to mean?" Instead of answering, Jake had reached into his pocket and pulled out that antique watch again. In the firelight, I'd been able to see that the brass surface was covered with the same symbols we'd seen on the stones around the ancient oak. "My great-grandfather wasn't the first of my family to come to these woods," Jake had said quietly. "My family has a long history with this place, a long history with the things that live here." "Things? What things?" Jake had smiled, and in that moment I'd known with absolute certainty that whatever was sitting across the fire from me, it wasn't entirely my friend anymore. The things that were here before the Cherokee, Mike, before the settlers, before human beings decided they owned the world. He'd leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. The things that are still here, waiting for the right invitation to come back. I'd wanted to run then, to grab my gear and sprint through the darkness toward where I hoped our car was parked, but something had kept me frozen in place. Perhaps it was the rational part of my mind insisting that Jake was still my friend, that he was having some kind of episode that could be talked through. Perhaps it was simple cowardice, the fear that running into the dark forest alone would be worse than staying with someone who was no longer entirely human. "You invited something, didn't you?" I'd whispered. "At the tree. You let something in." "I didn't let anything in, Mike." Jake's smile had grown wider, showing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "I let something out. Something that's been waiting a very long time to be free." That's when I'd noticed that our fire was burning the wrong color. Instead of the usual orange and yellow flames, the wood was burning with a sickly green light that cast everything in the clearing in an otherworldly glow. The shadows seemed to move independently of their sources, reaching toward me with grasping fingers. "The fire," I'd managed to say. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jake had stood up, and as he'd moved, I'd seen that his shadow was wrong too, stretching across the ground in directions that defied the position of the flames. "Do you know what it's burning, Mike? What's feeding those flames?" I'd looked more closely at the fire and felt my stomach lurch with horror. Mixed in with the wood were objects I hadn't seen Jake put there. Objects that looked disturbingly like bones. Small bones, some of them bearing traces of fur and feathers. "The forest provides," Jake had continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. "The forest has always provided, for those who know how to ask properly." "Jake, please," I'd begged, "you're scaring me. This isn't you." "But it is me, Mike. This is who I've always been, deep down, who my family has always been. We're caretakers, you see. Guardians of old ways, old contracts." He'd begun to pace around the fire, his movements fluid and predatory. "My great-grandfather made a deal here, in these woods. A deal that's been passed down through generations." "What kind of deal?" "Protection for the family line, in exchange for service. For providing what the old ones need when they're ready to walk the world again." Jake had stopped directly across the fire from me, his face illuminated by the green flames. "They need vessels, Mike. Bodies that can hold their essence, at least temporarily." The full horror of what was happening had finally crashed over me. "You're not Jake anymore." "I'm still Jake," the thing wearing my friend's face had replied. "I'm just more than Jake now, and soon you will be too." That's when I'd noticed the others. Figures had begun to emerge from the forest around our clearing, moving with the same fluid grace that Jake had displayed. At first, I'd thought they were people, other campers perhaps, drawn by our fire, but as they'd moved closer, I'd realized they were wrong in the same way Jake had become wrong. Their movements too smooth, their smiles too wide, their eyes reflecting light that wasn't there. "Friends of yours?" I'd asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Friends of the family," Jake had replied. "They've been waiting for you, Mike, waiting for someone to complete our little circle." I'd counted at least 6 figures surrounding our campsite, possibly more lurking in the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. All of them had the same wrongness about them, the same sense of being inhabited by something that didn't quite fit. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing you won't give willingly, in time," Jake had said. "The process is always easier when there's consent involved." "Process? The sharing, the joining. The old ones are tired of being shadows. Mike, they want to feel sunlight again, taste food, experience physical sensation. They need bodies to do that, and bodies need to be prepared properly." One of the figures had stepped closer to the firelight, and I'd gotten a good look at what had once been a human face. The features were still recognizably human, but something fundamental had changed. The eyes held an intelligence that was vast and alien, and when it had smiled at me, I'd seen teeth that belonged to something that had never been human at all. "How long?" I'd asked Jake. "How long have you been changed?" "Since the divorce, really. That's when I first came to these woods, when I first made contact. Sarah never understood, never appreciated the heritage I was trying to preserve." Jake had chuckled, a sound that had made my skin crawl. She thought I was having a breakdown. In a way, I suppose I was, breaking down the barriers between what I was and what I could become. Sarah? My girlfriend's name had sounded strange in this context, out of place. What does Sarah have to do with this? She was supposed to come with us originally, remember? Before she decided she had to work this weekend? Jake's smile had turned predatory. That would have been so much more convenient. 2 vessels prepared simultaneously. The old ones are always more comfortable when they can work in pairs. The full implications of what he was saying had hit me like a physical blow. This entire trip had been planned, orchestrated to bring me to this place, to these creatures. And Sarah had been intended as a victim, too. "You're insane," I'd said, though I'd known it wasn't insanity I was looking at. It was something far worse. "Insanity is a concept created by minds too small to comprehend larger realities," Jake had replied. "What you're seeing is evolution, Mike, the next step in human development." The figures around the clearing had begun to move closer, forming a tighter circle around our campfire. As they'd approached, I'd been able to see more details that had made my stomach turn. Their clothes were wrong, styles from different eras as if they'd been taken from people across decades. Some of the garments had been torn, stained with substances I'd preferred not to identify. "How many?" I'd whispered. "How many people have you brought here?" "Not me, personally," Jake had said. "This has been going on for generations, Mike. My family's contribution to something much larger than ourselves." I'd tried to think, to find some way out of the situation, but my mind had felt sluggish, clouded. The green smoke from the fire had grown thicker, and I'd realized I'd been breathing it for the better part of an hour. Whatever was burning in those flames, it was affecting my ability to think clearly. "The fire," I'd said. "You drugged the fire." "Nothing so crude," Jake had replied, "but certain plants, when burned with the proper offerings, can open the mind to new possibilities, make the transition easier." I'd tried to stand, to run, but my legs had felt like water. The world had begun to spin around me, colors bleeding into one another like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The figures around the campfire had begun to chant in a language I'd never heard before, their voices blending into a harmony that had seemed to resonate in my bones. "Don't fight it, Mike," Jake had said, his voice seeming to come from very far away. "Fighting only makes it more painful." But I had fought. Even as my vision had begun to tunnel and my thoughts had grown increasingly fragmented, I'd forced myself to move. I'd grabbed the first thing my hand had encountered, a heavy flashlight from my pack, and had swung it at the nearest figure with all the strength I could muster. The impact had been solid, connecting with what had felt like flesh and bone, and the figure had staggered backward with a sound that had been part scream, part roar. The others had reacted with surprise, as if they hadn't expected resistance, and in that moment of confusion, I'd seen my chance. I'd lurched to my feet and had run into the forest, crashing through underbrush, bouncing off trees, my drugged mind barely able to process direction or distance. Behind me, I'd heard pursuit, not just footsteps, but sounds that had belonged to no human throat, howls and shrieks and something that might have been laughter. I'd run until my lungs had burned and my legs had given out, finally collapsing beside what had felt like a stream. The cold water against my face had helped clear some of the fog from my mind, and I'd realized that the sounds of pursuit had faded. Either I'd lost them, or they'd decided to wait for me to come back on my own. I'd spent the rest of the night huddled against a fallen log, jumping at every sound, sure that each rustle in the underbrush had announced the arrival of Jake and his inhuman companions. But morning had come without incident, and I'd begun to hope that perhaps I'd escaped after all. That hope had been shattered when I'd tried to find my way back to our car. The forest had changed overnight. Trails I'd been sure I'd remembered were gone, replaced by dense thickets of thorns that had seemed to grow out of nowhere. The stream I'd followed down the mountain had been flowing uphill. Most disturbing of all, when I'd tried to use the sun to navigate, I'd realized it was rising in the wrong direction. I'd wandered for hours, growing increasingly desperate, before accepting the horrible truth. I was trapped. Whether through supernatural means or simply by becoming hopelessly lost, I couldn't find my way back to civilization. It was then that I'd heard Jake calling my name. His voice had drifted through the trees from multiple directions at once, sometimes close enough that I'd been sure he was just behind the next tree, sometimes so distant it had barely been audible, but always there, patient and persistent, like a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "Mike," the voice had called. "Mike, where are you? I'm worried about you." But it hadn't been Jake's voice. Not really. The tone had been right, the inflection familiar, but there had been something underneath it, something cold and alien that had made my skin crawl. "Come back to camp, Mike. We need to talk." I'd tried to move away from the voice, but no matter which direction I'd chosen, it had seemed to follow me. Worse, I'd begun to hear other voices joining in, the figures from around the campfire, all calling my name in unison, their voices blending into a harmony that had seemed to come from the forest itself. That's when I'd found the cabin. It had appeared without warning in a small clearing, a ramshackle structure that had looked as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. The roof had been partially collapsed, the windows broken, and the door had hung open on rusted hinges. But it had represented shelter, a place to hide until I could figure out what to do next. I'd approached cautiously, but the cabin had appeared to be abandoned. Inside, I'd found the remnants of someone's life, a moldy mattress in one corner, empty cans scattered across a makeshift table, and dozens of pieces of paper covered with handwritten text. It was there that I'd learned the true scope of what I'd stumbled into. The papers had been journal entries, written by someone named Thomas Clayton, dated over a period of several months 3 years earlier. According to his account, he'd come to the Shawnee National Forest as part of a research project, studying local folklore and indigenous legends. But something had gone wrong with his research. Day 23, one entry had read, "The locals won't talk about the Hollow Woods anymore. Mention the name and they get this look. Like I've said something obscene." One old woman crossed herself and refused to say another word. Day 31. Found the first of the stone circles today. The symbols are unlike anything in the archaeological record, but there's something familiar about them. Something that makes my head hurt if I look too long. Day 45. The dreams are getting worse. Always the same. Figures in the woods, calling my name, promising things I don't understand. I wake up with dirt under my fingernails as if I've been walking in my sleep. Day 67. They're real. The figures from the dreams, they're real. I saw them last night, standing at the edge of my camp. They look human, but they're not. They're something else, something that's learned to wear human shapes. The entries had continued for weeks, documenting Thomas's gradual descent into paranoia and terror. But it was the final entry that had made my blood run cold. Day 89. They're in my head now. I can feel them, pushing against my thoughts, trying to make room for themselves. The man who calls himself Morrison found me today. Says his family has been serving them for generations, that it's an honor to be chosen. He's bringing someone else tomorrow, someone to help with the transition. I don't want to transition. I don't want to share my body with something that's never been human, but I can feel my will slipping away. By the time anyone reads this, Thomas Clayton will be gone. Something else will be wearing his face, speaking with his voice. Don't trust anyone you meet in these woods. Don't trust anyone who tries to bring you to the sacred places, and whatever you do, don't let them take you to the tree." The journal had ended there, but I'd found other things in the cabin that had painted an even more disturbing picture. Photographs, dozens of them, showing the same clearing where Jake had taken me. But in these photos, the clearing hadn't been empty. People had been gathered around the ancient oak, some standing, some kneeling, all with their hands pressed against the massive trunk. And in every photo, their faces had been wrong in the same way Jake's had become wrong. I'd also found a map, hand-drawn but detailed, showing the layout of the forest and marking locations with the same symbols I'd seen on the stones. According to the map, there had been dozens of these places scattered throughout the area, each one connected to the others by lines that had formed some kind of geometric pattern. But most disturbing of all had been the list of names I'd discovered tucked behind one of the photographs. Hundreds of names, organized by date, going back over a century. Next to each name had been a single word: taken, or prepared, or serving. Jake Morrison's name had been on the list with a date from 6 months earlier and the word prepared beside it. At the bottom of the list, in what had looked like Jake's handwriting, were 2 more names: Michael Williams and Sarah Mitchell, both followed by question marks. I'd been studying the list when I'd heard footsteps outside the cabin. "Mike," Jake's voice had called from just beyond the broken door. "I know you're in there. I can smell your fear." I'd frantically gathered the journal and photographs, stuffing them into my jacket before looking for another way out of the cabin. But there had been only one door, and Jake had been standing right outside it. "Come out, Mike. Let's finish what we started." "Stay away from me," I'd shouted, grabbing a piece of broken lumber from the floor. "I know what you are." Jake had laughed, a sound that had held no human warmth. Do you really understand what I've become? What I can offer you?" "I understand that you're not my friend anymore. I understand that you've been planning this for months." Planning is such a crude word. I prefer to think of it as destiny unfolding. Jake had stepped into the doorway, and I'd seen that he was no longer alone. The other figures from the campfire had been with him, their wrongly human faces twisted into expressions of hunger. "The old ones have been waiting so long for new vessels. Mike, strong, healthy bodies to house their consciousness. You should be honored. Honored to be possessed by demons? Not demons, that's such a limited Christian concept. These are entities that existed before human civilization, before human religion, before humans at all. They're the original inhabitants of this world, and they want it back." One of the other figures had moved closer, and I'd gotten a better look at its face. It had been wearing the features of a young woman, probably in her 20s, but the eyes had been ancient, filled with an intelligence that predated humanity. "The process isn't painful," she'd said in a voice like honey over broken glass. "After the initial adjustment period, you'll find that sharing your consciousness is quite liberating. You'll have access to knowledge accumulated over millennia, perspectives that span eons. And what happens to me? To who I really am?" "You'll still be you," Jake had answered, "just enhanced, improved, given purpose beyond your mundane existence." But I'd seen the truth in Thomas Clayton's journal. I'd read about the gradual erosion of self, the way the original personality was slowly consumed by something vast and hungry. Whatever these things were offering, it wasn't coexistence. It was obliteration disguised as transcendence. "I'd rather die," I'd said, raising the piece of lumber. "Death is always an option," another figure had said, this one wearing the face of an elderly man whose eyes held the same ancient intelligence. "But it's so final, so wasteful." That's when I'd noticed something crucial. While they'd been talking, trying to convince me to surrender willingly, none of them had actually entered the cabin. They'd remained outside, as if there were some invisible barrier preventing them from crossing the threshold. I'd looked around the interior more carefully and had spotted what I'd missed before: symbols carved into the wooden beams. The same protective markings I'd seen in Thomas Clayton's research photos. Someone, probably Thomas himself, had warded this place against the entities that haunted these woods. "You can't come in here, can you?" I'd said, a desperate hope rising in my chest. Jake's expression had darkened. "Temporary inconvenience. The protections will fade with time, or we can simply wait for you to come out. You'll need water eventually, food. You can't stay in there forever." He'd been right, of course. I'd had no supplies, no way to contact the outside world, and no clear idea of how to escape the forest even if I could get past them. But the warded cabin had bought me time, and time was what I'd needed to think. I'd spent the rest of that day studying Thomas Clayton's research, trying to understand the nature of what I was dealing with. According to his notes, the entities were indeed ancient, predating human civilization by millions of years. They'd once walked the earth freely, but something had changed, some cosmic shift that had bound them to specific locations, trapped them in the spaces between dimensions. The Cherokee had known about them, had developed rituals and protections to keep them contained. But as the indigenous population had dwindled and their knowledge had been lost, the entities had begun to find new ways to influence the physical world. They'd started making contact with isolated individuals, offering power and longevity in exchange for service. Jake's family had apparently been serving them for generations, each member passing down the obligation to the next. But the entity's ultimate goal hadn't been simply to maintain a few human servants. They'd wanted to return to the physical world permanently, and that required a massive influx of suitable hosts. The tree I'd seen, the ancient oak with its circle of carved stones, was apparently some kind of focal point, a place where the barrier between dimensions was weakest. The more people who were prepared at that location, the stronger the entities became, and the easier it became for them to manifest physically. But there had been hope in Thomas's research as well. The entities were bound by certain rules, cosmic laws that even they couldn't break. They couldn't simply take control of someone. There had to be some level of consent, even if that consent was obtained through deception or coercion. And the protective symbols that warded this cabin could be reproduced, used to create safe zones that they couldn't violate. As night had fallen and Jake and his companions had continued their vigil outside, I'd begun to formulate a plan. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was the only chance I could see. Using Thomas's research as a guide, I'd carved additional protective symbols into the cabin walls, strengthening the barriers that kept the entities at bay. Then I'd waited, listening to their increasingly frustrated attempts to convince me to emerge voluntarily. "Mike," Jake had called throughout the night, his voice taking on different tones and inflections. Sometimes he'd sounded like the friend I'd known, pleading and concerned. Other times he'd sounded angry, threatening. Once he'd even sounded like Sarah, though the illusion had been imperfect, the voice just slightly wrong. "Sarah's worried about you," the fake Sarah voice had said. "She's coming to look for you. Do you really want her to find you like this, hiding in a shack like a coward?" But I'd known it was a lie. Sarah was safe in Chicago, probably wondering why I hadn't called, but safe. At least, I'd hoped she was safe. The list with her name on it had suggested that Jake had planned to target her eventually, but there was nothing I could do about that from my current position. By dawn, I'd completed my preparations. I'd carved protective symbols into pieces of wood that I could carry, had fashioned a crude torch from materials I'd found in the cabin, and had mentally rehearsed the route I'd need to take based on Thomas's map. The entities were still waiting outside when I'd finally emerged, but I'd been ready for them. The moment Jake had moved to intercept me, I'd pressed one of my carved symbols against his chest. The reaction had been immediate and violent. He'd screamed and had staggered backward, smoke rising from where the wood had contacted his skin. "Iron and faith," I'd muttered, remembering something from Thomas's notes about the materials that were effective against these creatures. The symbols were carved into oak, and I'd used an old iron nail from the cabin to trace them. The other entities had recoiled as well, giving me the opening I'd needed to break through their circle and run into the forest. But this time, I hadn't run blindly. I'd had a destination, another location marked on Thomas's map, a place he'd identified as having natural protective properties. The chase that had followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The entities hadn't been bound by human limitations. They'd moved through the forest like liquid shadow, flowing around trees and over obstacles, their inhuman voices calling my name from every direction. But the protective charms I'd carried had kept them from getting too close, creating a bubble of safety that had allowed me to stay ahead of them. I'd reached my destination just as my strength had begun to fail. A natural cave set into a rocky outcropping, its entrance flanked by what Thomas had identified as naturally occurring protective formations. According to his research, the cave had been used by Cherokee shamans as a place of power, somewhere they'd gone to commune with benevolent spirits. The entities had followed me to the cave mouth, but once again they'd been unable to enter. Jake had stood at the threshold, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Mike," he'd snarled. "We have all the time in the world. You have maybe a few days before you die of thirst." "Maybe," I'd replied, settling down near the back of the cave. "But maybe that's enough." Enough for what? Instead of answering, I'd begun the ritual I'd found described in Thomas's notes. It was dangerous, potentially fatal, but it offered the only real chance of stopping what was happening in these woods. Using the iron nail and my own blood, I'd begun carving symbols into the cave floor, symbols designed not to keep the entities out, but to sever their connection to this dimensional plane entirely. The reaction had been immediate. The temperature in the cave had dropped by what had felt like 30 degrees, and the air had begun to shimmer with an energy that had made my teeth ache. Outside the cave, the entities had begun to howl, a sound of pure rage and desperation. "Stop!" Jake had screamed. "You don't understand what you're doing." But I'd understood perfectly. Thomas's research had been thorough, and the ritual he described was a permanent solution. Not just to banish the entities temporarily, but to seal the dimensional rifts that allowed them access to our world in the first place. The cost was that it required a life to power it, someone willing to sacrifice themselves to complete the binding. I'd been prepared to make that sacrifice, but as I'd neared the completion of the ritual, something unexpected had happened. The cave had begun to fill with light, not the sickly phosphorescence I'd seen around the entities, but a warm, golden radiance that had seemed to push back the cold. Figures had begun to materialize in the light, translucent, ethereal, but unmistakably human. Cherokee shamans, I'd realized, the original guardians of this place, drawn by the ritual I was performing. They'd gathered around me, adding their power to mine, their voices joining in the chant I'd been reciting. The effect on the entities outside had been catastrophic. Their howls had turned to screams of agony as the dimensional rifts had begun to collapse, cutting off their connection to our reality. Jake had been the last to go, his stolen human form dissolving like smoke as whatever had been inhabiting it was pulled back into the void between worlds. "Mike," he'd called out one final time, and for just a moment his voice had sounded genuinely human again. "I'm sorry. I couldn't control it. Tell Sarah. Tell her I'm sorry." Then he'd been gone, along with all the others, leaving me alone in the cave with the fading spirits of the Cherokee guardians. As the light had dimmed and the shamans had disappeared, one of them had turned to me with an expression of profound gratitude. "The woods are clean now," he'd said in a voice like wind through leaves. "The old darkness is banished, but you must leave this place and never return, and you must warn others. There are other places like this, other rifts that need to be sealed." I'd nodded, too exhausted to speak, and the spirit had smiled before fading away entirely. The journey back to civilization had taken 2 days. The forest had returned to normal, the trails appearing where they should be, the sun rising in the proper direction. I'd found our car where we'd left it, Jake's keys still in his jacket pocket, and had driven straight to the nearest police station. Of course, they hadn't believed my story. 2 men had gone camping, Only one had returned, claiming his friend had been possessed by ancient entities and had disappeared when dimensional rifts collapsed. I'd been questioned for hours, subjected to psychological evaluation, treated as either a suspect or a victim of trauma-induced delusion. But I'd had evidence: Thomas Clayton's journal, the photographs, the list of names. The authorities had investigated the cabin, had found it exactly as I'd described, and had discovered that many of the names on the list matched missing persons reports dating back decades. There were too many corroborating details for them to dismiss entirely, even if they couldn't accept the supernatural explanation. In the end, they'd classified Jake's disappearance as death by misadventure, probably animal attack with the body carried off. The case had been closed, and I'd been free to return to my normal life. But normal life had proven elusive. I'd tried to go back to work, to pretend that nothing had changed, but the knowledge of what lurked in the spaces between reality had made everything else seem trivial. Worse, I'd begun to research other locations, other places where similar disappearances had occurred, and I'd found a pattern that had chilled me to the bone. The Cherokee shaman had been right. There were other rifts, other places where ancient entities pressed against the boundaries of our world. And somewhere out there, other families like Jake's were still serving them, still bringing fresh victims to feed their hunger for human consciousness. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've made it my mission to find these places, to identify the warning signs and, when possible, to seal the rifts before more people disappear. It's dangerous work. I've had several close calls, encountered entities that make what I faced in Illinois seem almost benign, but it's necessary work. Sarah and I broke up 3 months ago. I couldn't tell her the truth about what had happened to Jake, couldn't explain why I'd started traveling constantly, seeking out remote locations where people vanished without explanation. She thought I was having some kind of breakdown, and maybe I was. Maybe I still am. But I know what I've seen, what I've experienced, and I know that somewhere out there in forests and mountains and forgotten places, things that should have stayed buried are stirring. The network Jake's family served was larger than I'd imagined, and his disappearance was just the beginning. I'm writing this in another hotel room, in another small town at the edge of another wilderness area where hikers have been disappearing. Tomorrow, I'll go into those woods, armed with iron and faith and the knowledge that sometimes the only way to save others is to risk everything yourself. I don't know if I'll survive what's waiting out there. The entities are learning, adapting, finding new ways to circumvent the protections that once held them back. But I have to try, because if I don't, if no one does, then eventually they'll break through completely. And when that happens, when the old darkness returns to claim the world it once ruled, there won't be anywhere left to hide. The woods are full of shadows, and some of those shadows have teeth. Remember that. If you ever find yourself in places where the trees grow too close together and the silence feels too complete, remember that, and maybe you'll live long enough to see the sunrise again. But probably not. Author's note: this journal was found in room 237 of the Pine Ridge Motel in Carbondale, Illinois, 3 days after Michael Williams checked in but failed to check out. His rental car was discovered abandoned at the Pounds Hollow trailhead in the Shawnee National Forest. Despite extensive search efforts, my name is Jessica Davis, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backwoods of Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, near the abandoned settlement of Drury, where the old coal mining operations left scars in the earth that never quite healed. I should have listened to my instincts when Marcus suggested we take this camping trip. Should have paid attention to the way my stomach twisted when he spread that topographical map across our kitchen table, his finger tracing the hiking trails that snaked through the most isolated corners of southern Illinois. But I was desperate to save our relationship, to prove that I could be the adventurous girlfriend he wanted, not the anxious city girl who jumped at shadows. "Look at this place," Marcus had said, his green eyes lighting up with that familiar enthusiasm that used to make my heart race. "Devil's Kitchen Lake, Garden of the Gods, It's like having the wilderness right in our backyard. When's the last time we did something together? Just us?" The answer was 3 months, but I didn't say that. Instead, I watched him pack his expensive camping gear, the kind that screamed weekend warrior rather than experienced outdoorsman, and tried to ignore the dread pooling in my chest like cold water. Our friend Tyler Bailey had invited himself along at the last minute, claiming he needed to get away from the divorce drama. At 35, Tyler was going through his second messy separation and had been crashing on various friends' couches for weeks. He arrived at our apartment Friday morning looking haggard, his usually neat brown hair unwashed and his clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. "This is exactly what I need," he said, hefting a worn backpack that had seen better decades. "Fresh air, no cell service, no lawyers calling every 5 minutes." The three of us loaded into Marcus's Jeep and headed south on I-57, leaving Chicago's skyline in the rearview mirror. The October air held the crisp promise of winter, and the forests were painted in brilliant oranges and reds that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt ominous, like nature was bleeding. We reached the trailhead near Burden Falls around noon. The parking area was deserted except for a rusted pickup truck that looked abandoned, its tires flat and windows spiderwebbed with cracks. A wooden sign marked our trail. Bell Smith Springs, moderate difficulty, 6.2 miles. Someone had scratched additional words into the weathered wood, but they were too faded to read clearly. "Perfect," Marcus said, shouldering his pristine REI pack. "We'll hike to the springs, set up camp, then explore the area tomorrow." The trail started innocently enough, winding through dense hardwood forest where the canopy filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the leaf-strewn ground. But something felt wrong from the beginning. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, just our footsteps crunching on dead leaves and the rasp of our breathing. "Anyone else notice how dead it is out here?" Tyler asked after we'd been walking for an hour. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. "It's October," Marcus replied dismissively. "Animals are probably preparing for winter." But I knew Tyler was right. I'd grown up visiting my grandmother's farm downstate, and I knew what healthy forest sounded like. This silence was unnatural, oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The trail began to climb steadily, and soon we were navigating rocky outcroppings and narrow ledges carved from ancient sandstone. The trees here were different, twisted and stunted, their branches reaching toward us like gnarled fingers. Many were dead, their bark blackened as if by fire, though I could see no evidence of recent burns. "GPS is acting weird," Marcus said, frowning at his phone. "It keeps showing us in different locations." I checked mine and found the same thing. The blue dot that represented our position jumped erratically across the screen, sometimes placing us miles from where we should be, sometimes showing us as moving backwards even as we climbed higher into the hills. "Cell towers are probably sparse out here," I said, but my voice sounded thin and unconvincing. We reached Bell Smith Springs around 4 o'clock, and I had to admit it was beautiful in a stark, otherworldly way. Clear water bubbled up from underground sources, forming pools among the sandstone formations. But the beauty felt wrong somehow, like a trap baited with something lovely. "This is perfect," Marcus said, dropping his pack near a flat area between two large rocks. "We'll have shelter from the wind and water right here." As we set up our tents, I noticed strange markings carved into the surrounding stones, symbols that looked almost like letters but belonged to no alphabet I recognized. When I pointed them out, Tyler went pale. "Those look fresh," he said, running his finger along one of the deeper grooves, "but this stone has to be hundreds of years old." "Probably just graffiti," Marcus said, but he moved his tent away from the marked stones. We managed to get a fire going as the sun began to set, though the wood burned strangely, too fast and with an odd, sweet smell that made my stomach turn. The flames danced in colors that weren't quite natural, occasionally flashing green or blue before returning to normal orange. "Anyone hungry?" Tyler asked, pulling out a can of chili. "I'm starving." But none of us had much appetite. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on us, making even simple conversation feel forced. We sat around the fire in uncomfortable silence, jumping at every crack of settling wood or rustle in the darkness beyond our small circle of light. That's when we heard the first sound. It started as a low humming, barely audible above the crackling fire, almost like someone singing a lullaby just out of earshot. We all heard it, though none of us spoke at first. "What is that?" I finally whispered. The humming stopped immediately, as if it had been waiting for acknowledgement. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. "Wind through the rocks," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These formations probably create acoustic effects." The humming resumed, clearer now and definitely not natural. It had a rhythm, a melody that seemed familiar yet alien. Worse, it seemed to be getting closer. "I think we should leave," I said, standing up so quickly I knocked over my camp chair. "First thing in the morning. This place feels wrong." "Don't be ridiculous," Marcus snapped, but I could see fear in his eyes too. "We just got here. You can't run away from every little thing that makes you nervous." His words stung because they were true. I had been running from things lately, from commitment, from taking risks, from being the person he needed me to be. But this was different. This was survival. The humming continued through the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant, never quite stopping long enough for us to convince ourselves we'd imagined it. I lay in my sleeping bag with every muscle tensed, listening to Tyler's restless movements in the tent beside ours and Marcus's forced, steady breathing that I knew meant he was awake too. Around 3 in the morning, the humming stopped entirely. I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by Tyler screaming. I unzipped my tent and stumbled outside to find him standing by the dead fire, his face white as bone in the starlight. He was staring at something in the darkness beyond our camp. "Tyler, what?" "She was right there," he whispered, pointing at the tree line, standing right fucking there, watching us. "Who was there?" Marcus demanded, emerging from our tent with a flashlight. "I don't know. A woman, I think. But something was wrong with her. She was too tall, and her arms were too long." Marcus swept his flashlight across the area Tyler indicated, but the beam revealed nothing but twisted trees and shadows. "You were dreaming," Marcus said. "Nightmares from all this divorce stress." But I could see Tyler wasn't convinced, and neither was I. The air still felt charged with presence, as if something had been watching us and might still be out there in the darkness. We didn't sleep again that night. We sat around the cold fire pit, taking turns with the flashlight, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, pale and gray through the canopy, we were all exhausted and on edge. "I'm hiking back to the car," I announced while packing my sleeping bag. "This place is wrong, and I'm not spending another night here." "Fine," Marcus said, his jaw tight with anger and embarrassment. "Run away like you always do." The words hit me like a physical blow, but before I could respond, Tyler spoke up. "Actually, I think Jessica's right. Something's not normal here. Look around. Have you seen a single bird since we arrived? Not even insects. And what about those symbols? And the humming?" Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but fatigue and his own suppressed fear won out. "Fine. We'll pack up after breakfast." But breakfast never happened. Tyler volunteered to gather more wood for the fire, saying he'd spotted some good deadfall about 50 yards into the forest. He took the hatchet and walked into the trees, whistling tunelessly. We could hear him for about 10 minutes, the regular thunk of the hatchet against wood, the crash of branches falling. Then silence. "Tyler?" Marcus called after another 10 minutes had passed. "You okay out there?" No answer. We waited another 5 minutes before grabbing flashlights and heading into the woods. We found the spot easily enough, fresh wood chips scattered around a half-chopped branch, the hatchet embedded in a fallen log. But no Tyler. "Tyler!" I shouted, not caring what else might hear me. "Where are you?" Our voices echoed strangely in the dead forest, seeming to stretch and distort before fading into silence. We spent 2 hours searching, calling his name, following every possible path he might have taken, but it was as if he'd simply vanished. No footprints led away from the chopping site. No broken branches marked a path through the underbrush. He was just gone. "We need to hike back and get help," I said, trying to keep panic out of my voice. "Call park rangers, search and rescue." Marcus nodded, but as we returned to camp, we found our first real hint that something supernatural was at work. Tyler was sitting by our cold fire pit. He looked up as we approached and smiled. It was Tyler's face, Tyler's body, even Tyler's clothes. But the smile was wrong. Too wide, lasting too long, never reaching his eyes. "Where were you?" Marcus demanded. "We've been looking everywhere." "Gathering wood," Tyler said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Like I said I would." But he had no wood with him, and his hands, which should have been dirty from handling logs and bark, were perfectly clean. "Tyler, are you feeling okay?" I asked, stepping closer. "You seem different." He turned that unnatural smile on me, and I saw that his pupils were dilated to black circles with just thin rings of brown around the edges. "I'm fine, Jessica. Better than fine. I've never felt so clear." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. There was something possessive about it, something hungry. "We're leaving," Marcus announced, shouldering his pack. "All of us, now." Tyler's smile never wavered. "Of course, whatever you think is best." But as we hiked back toward the trailhead, Tyler began to lag behind. When we turned to check on him, he was standing motionless on the trail, staring into the forest with that same empty smile. "Tyler, come on," Marcus shouted. "I'm coming," Tyler replied, but he didn't move. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rocks in impossible ways. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that while Tyler's mouth had moved, the words had come from somewhere behind us. I spun around to find another Tyler standing about 20 feet away, watching us with those same dilated eyes and that terrible smile. "Which one is real?" I whispered. Marcus grabbed my hand, his palm slick with sweat. "Neither," he said. "Run." We ran. Behind us, I could hear laughter. Tyler's laughter, but multiplied, coming from all directions at once. The sound chased us down the trail, growing louder and more distorted until it barely sounded human at all. The trail seemed different now, paths branching off in directions that hadn't existed before. The GPS on Marcus's phone spun wildly, unable to lock onto our location. Worse, the sun seemed to be moving wrong in the sky, sometimes appearing in the east when it should have been west, sometimes disappearing entirely behind clouds that looked more like smoke. "The car," Marcus panted as we ran. "We just need to reach the car." But when we finally stumbled into what should have been the parking area, we found only forest. No trail signs, no gravel lot, no rusted pickup truck. Just endless trees stretching in every direction. "This can't be right," I said, turning in a slow circle. We followed the trail. "We came this way." Marcus pulled out his map, but the paper crumbled at his touch, disintegrating into gray ash that the wind scattered through the trees. That's when we heard Tyler's voice again, closer now. "Jessica. Marcus. Where are you going?" He emerged from the tree line ahead of us, still wearing that horrible smile. But now I could see that something was fundamentally wrong with his proportions. His arms hung too low, his fingers stretched too long, and when he moved, it was with a loose, boneless gait that no human should have been able to manage. "You can't leave yet," he said, his voice wet and thick. "I haven't shown you what I found." Behind us, I heard footsteps. More Tylers were emerging from the forest, surrounding us. Some looked exactly like our friend, while others were distorted, too tall, or with faces that were almost right but subtly wrong, like reflections in funhouse mirrors. "What do you want?" Marcus demanded, though his voice cracked with fear. The original Tyler, or the closest thing to him, tilted his head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "I want you to understand," he said. "I want you to see what I've seen, feel what I've felt." "Tyler, fight it," I pleaded. "Whatever's controlling you, fight it. You're stronger than this." For just a moment, his expression flickered. The smile faltered, and I saw genuine terror in his eyes. "Jessica," he whispered, and his voice was truly his own. "It's hungry. It's been hungry for so long, and now I'm hungry too." The moment passed, and the smile returned wider than before. "But the hunger can end," the thing wearing Tyler's face continued. "All you have to do is join us. Become part of the forest, part of the family." The circle of false Tylers began to close in, and I could see now that they weren't quite solid. Their edges seemed to blur and shift, as if they were made of shadow and malice rather than flesh and bone. Marcus grabbed my hand. "The springs," he whispered. "If we can get back to the springs, maybe we can find the real trail." I nodded, understanding. Water was often a barrier to supernatural entities in folklore. Maybe it would provide some protection. "On 3, Marcus mouthed silently. Before he could count, I broke free and ran toward the smallest gap in the circle. Marcus followed, and we crashed through the line of Tyler things into the forest beyond. They didn't pursue us immediately, and in that moment of reprieve, I realized why. They were hurting us, driving us deeper into the woods, farther from any hope of escape, but we had no choice except to keep running. The forest seemed to shift around us as we moved, trees rearranging themselves to block certain paths while opening others. We were being guided, manipulated, led like sheep to slaughter. Finally, exhausted and lost, we collapsed beside a small stream. The water was ice cold and tasted of minerals and something else, something organic and wrong. "This isn't Bell Smith Springs," Marcus said, looking around at the unfamiliar rock formations. "Nothing's been right since we got here," I replied. "I don't think we're even in the same forest anymore." As if summoned by my words, Tyler appeared on the opposite bank of the stream. Just one this time. But somehow that was worse than the multitude. He looked more like himself now, which made the wrongness even more apparent. "You can't run forever," he said, and his voice carried perfectly across the water despite being barely above a whisper. "The forest knows you're here. It's marked you." "What are you?" Marcus demanded. "What did you do with our friend?" Tyler's smile turned sad, and for a moment I almost believed he was still himself. "Tyler's here," he said. "He's part of me now, part of us. He wanted the pain to stop, the divorce, the loneliness, the constant feeling that he wasn't good enough. So we took his pain away. We can take yours too." I felt a strange pull at his words, the promise of release from anxiety, from the constant fear that I wasn't brave enough, strong enough, good enough for Marcus. It would be so easy to just let go. "No," I said, as much to myself as to the thing across the stream. "No, that's not living. That's just existing." Tyler's expression hardened. "Then you've chosen suffering." He stepped into the stream, and I held my breath, hoping the water would stop him. But he walked across as easily as if it were dry land, not even creating ripples on the surface. Marcus and I scrambled backward, but we were trapped against a steep rock face. Tyler approached slowly, savoring our fear. "I'll make it quick," he said, and his fingers began to elongate into razor-sharp claws. Tyler fought at the end, but he was weak from grief. "You might last longer." That's when I saw it, a flash of metal in the dying light. The hatchet Tyler had been using was somehow here, embedded in a fallen log just within reach. As Tyler lunged forward, I grabbed the hatchet and swung with all my strength. The blade caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled backward with a shriek that sounded like wind through dead leaves. Where the hatchet had struck, his flesh crumbled away like dry bark, revealing something black and writhing underneath. Iron, I realized. It doesn't like iron. Tyler's face contorted with rage, his features shifting and blurring until he looked more like a crude sculpture of a person than the real thing. "You cannot escape," he snarled, his voice now coming from everywhere at once. "This forest has claimed you. You are already part of it." As he spoke, I became aware of roots breaking through the ground around our feet, growing at impossible speed and reaching for our ankles. The trees began to close in, their branches weaving together to form a cage. But the hatchet was still in my hand, and desperation gave me strength. I began chopping at the encroaching roots and branches, the iron blade biting deep into the supernatural wood. Where I struck, the growth stopped, the plants withering and pulling back as if burned. "Marcus, help me!" I shouted. Tossing him my camping knife. "Anything metal? Use it." Together, we hacked our way through the living cage, ignoring Tyler's inhuman screams of rage. The forest fought us every step of the way, but iron seemed to be its weakness, and we pressed forward through sheer determination. Finally, we broke free of the immediate trap and ran deeper into the woods, still carrying our metal weapons. Behind us, Tyler's voice rose in a howl of fury that shook the very trees. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, then collapsed in a small clearing where ancient stones formed a rough circle. The moment we crossed into the ring, the oppressive feeling lifted slightly, and Tyler's voice faded to a distant whisper. "What is this place?" Marcus gasped. I looked at the weathered stones more closely and saw that they were carved with symbols. Not the twisted marks we'd seen at the springs, but something older and more protective. A ward, perhaps, or sanctuary. "Somewhere safe," I said, hoping I was right. We huddled together in the center of the stone circle as night fell, taking turns keeping watch. The forest around us writhed and whispered, shapes moving just beyond the edge of the circle, but nothing crossed the boundary marked by the ancient stones. Tyler appeared several times throughout the night, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by other figures, people who looked like they might have been hikers or campers once before the forest claimed them. They pleaded with us to come out, promising safety, comfort, an end to fear. But they couldn't enter the circle, and as dawn approached, they faded away like mist. When the sun finally rose, we found ourselves in a different forest entirely. The trees were healthy and green, birds sang in the branches, and insects hummed in the morning air. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by the normal sounds and smells of a living woodland. "How?" Marcus asked, looking around in wonder. I touched one of the protective stones, feeling the warmth that still radiated from its ancient surface. "I think we stumbled into something old," I said. "Older than whatever was wearing Tyler's face, something that's been fighting that hunger for a very long time." We found the real trail within an hour, marked with proper Forest Service signs and leading in a straight line back to the parking area. Our Jeep was waiting exactly where we'd left it, though I could have sworn it had been moved slightly. As we drove away from Shawnee National Forest, I looked back once at the dark line of trees receding in the distance. For just a moment, I thought I saw a familiar figure standing at the forest's edge, watching us go. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. The official search for Tyler Bailey lasted 3 weeks. They found his backpack, his wallet, and one hiking boot, but no trace of Tyler himself. The Park Service concluded that he had fallen into one of the many unmapped caves in the area and that his body might never be recovered. Marcus and I gave our statements, describing how Tyler had gone to collect firewood and never returned. We didn't mention the things that couldn't be explained, the hunger that wore familiar faces, or the ancient stones that had saved our lives. Our relationship didn't survive the experience. How could it? We'd both seen too much, changed too much. Marcus threw himself into work, staying late every night as if afraid to face the darkness. I started therapy and gradually learned to sleep without nightmares. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the city streets, I hear an echo of that hungry humming. And I know that somewhere in the deep woods of southern Illinois, something is still waiting for the next group of lost travelers to wander off the marked trails. I've never been camping since. The iron hatchet sits in my apartment closet, wrapped in an old towel. I tell myself I keep it for protection, but the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I keep it because I know that someday the hunger might find its way to the city, and when it does, I'll be ready. My name is Michael Williams and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Shawnee National Forest, deep in the hills near Garden of the Gods in southern Illinois, where ancient sandstone formations rise like silent sentinels against an endless canopy of oak and hickory. The plan had been simple: a weekend camping trip with my girlfriend Sarah Rodriguez and our two best friends from college, Kevin King and Amanda Wright. We'd been planning this getaway for months, all of us desperately needing an escape from our soul-crushing office jobs in Chicago. The Shawnee Hills promised solitude, stunning rock formations, and miles of unmarked trails perfect for serious hikers like ourselves. I should have known something was wrong when my dog, Bear, a usually fearless German Shepherd mix, refused to get out of the car at our chosen campsite near Bell Smith Springs. The 100-pound animal pressed himself against the passenger door, whimpering in a way I'd never heard before, a sound that seemed to vibrate from somewhere deep in his chest, like a warning. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, tugging gently at his collar. "It's just trees." But Bear's amber eyes were fixed on something beyond the tree line, something the rest of us couldn't see. His ears lay flat against his skull, and a low growl rumbled in his throat as he finally, reluctantly, followed me toward our campsite. Sarah, an environmental science graduate who could identify every species of flora within a 50-mile radius, was already examining the unusual absence of birdsong in the area. "It's too quiet," she murmured, her dark hair catching the filtered afternoon sunlight. "Even for late October, there should be more wildlife activity." Kevin, ever the pragmatist and former Eagle Scout, was busy setting up his expensive REI tent with military precision. "Probably just the weather," he said, though I noticed him glancing frequently at the sky, which had maintained an odd, yellowish tinge since we'd arrived. Storm front, coming in. Amanda, our group's designated photographer and eternal optimist, was already snapping pictures of the towering bluffs surrounding us. Through her viewfinder, she captured images that would later reveal things none of us noticed at the time: shadows that fell in impossible directions and what appeared to be faces in the rock formations themselves. We'd chosen this particular spot because it was unmarked on most maps, accessible only via a narrow deer trail that wound 3 miles from the nearest fire road. The isolation was exactly what we'd wanted, a chance to disconnect completely from civilization. Our phones showed no signal, which we'd expected, but what we hadn't anticipated was how the GPS devices seemed to spin wildly, unable to lock onto any satellites despite the clear sky above. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke several times to find Bear pressed against my sleeping bag, his body rigid with tension. Each time I opened my eyes, he was staring toward the woods, ears perked at sounds I couldn't detect. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like being wrapped in a heavy blanket that muffled not just sound but thought itself. By morning, our carefully organized camp had somehow become subtly disheveled. Kevin's meticulously arranged gear was scattered as if by wind, though the night had been still. Sarah's field notes, which she'd left weighted down by a rock, were found 30 feet away, the pages covered in what looked like small, deliberate tears, too precise to be from animals. "Did anyone else notice the fire?" Amanda asked as we gathered around our cold campfire ring for breakfast. I could have sworn I banked the coals properly, but it was completely out when I got up to use the bathroom around 3. I remembered the fire too, or thought I did. The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I recalled sitting around flames that seemed to burn in shades of blue and green I'd never seen before, casting shadows that moved independently of our bodies. But now, in daylight, the memory seemed impossible. Bear refused to eat his breakfast, instead pacing the perimeter of our camp with his hackles raised. When I tried to comfort him, his usually gentle mouth snapped at my hand, not to bite, but as if to say, "Don't touch me. Can't you sense it too?" We decided to hike to Camel Rock, a formation about 2 miles deeper into the forest. The trail was supposed to be well marked, but we found ourselves having to rely on Kevin's compass more than expected, as the path seemed to fork and twist in ways that didn't match our topographical maps. "These maps are from 2018, Sarah said, frowning at the discrepancies. "The landscape doesn't change that much in 5 years." But as we walked, it became clear that something was fundamentally wrong with our navigation. Landmarks appeared and disappeared. A distinctive dead oak that we'd used as a reference point seemed to be following us, appearing first on our left, then our right, then somehow ahead of us on the trail. The temperature began to drop precipitously as afternoon approached, though our weather app had predicted mild conditions. Our breath started to mist, and Amanda complained that her camera was fogging up despite the apparent humidity being low. It was Kevin who first noticed that our shadows weren't behaving correctly. "Look at this," he said, stopping abruptly on the trail. He raised his arm, and while the shadow cast by his body remained normal, the shadow of his arm seemed to lag behind the movement by several seconds, creating a disturbing double image effect. We all tested it. Each of us experienced the same phenomenon: shadows that moved like thick molasses, creating temporal echoes of our movements. Amanda tried to photograph it, but her camera captured only normal shadows, as if the device couldn't perceive what our eyes were witnessing. That's when Bear began to whine incessantly, a high-pitched sound that cut through the unnatural silence like a blade. He was staring down the trail ahead of us, his entire body trembling with barely contained terror. A figure was walking toward us. At first, it appeared to be just another hiker, a woman in a red jacket, moving with the steady gait of someone familiar with these trails. But as she drew closer, the wrongness became apparent. Her feet weren't quite touching the ground, hovering perhaps an inch above the forest floor. Her hair moved in a breeze that none of us could feel, and her face was Sarah's face. Not similar to Sarah's, it was Sarah's exact face, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the slight asymmetry of her smile, even the way she tilted her head when curious. But this wasn't Sarah. Sarah was standing right beside me, her hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel my circulation being cut off. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. That's me." The doppelganger Sarah smiled. Too wide, too long, stretching the familiar features into something grotesque. When she spoke, the voice was perfect too, but the words came from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was speaking. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, and I felt the words vibrate in my chest cavity. "This place doesn't like visitors. It doesn't like to be disturbed." Bear lunged forward, not attacking but trying to place himself between us and the entity. The thing wearing Sarah's face looked down at him with mock sympathy. "Clever animal," it said. "Animals always know. They can sense when time and space aren't quite aligned." Kevin, his face pale but determined, stepped forward. "What do you want?" The Sarah thing laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in reverse, sharp fragments assembling into something whole and terrible. "Want? I don't want anything. I'm just the messenger. This place has rules. You've broken them simply by being here." "What rules?" Amanda demanded, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. "The rule of belonging," the entity replied. "Everything here belongs to this place. The trees, the rocks, the shadows, and now you." The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in seconds. Our breath became thick clouds, and frost began forming on the trees around us despite it being October afternoon. The doppelganger Sarah began to change, her features remaining identical but somehow becoming increasingly wrong. Skin too pale, eyes too bright, movements too fluid. "One of you will stay," she continued conversationally. "That's how it works. The forest takes one, and the others get to leave. But you'll never really leave, will you? You'll always wonder who you left behind." I felt Sarah's grip on my arm tighten even more. "We're leaving," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "All of us. Right now." The thing smiled, that horrible stretched smile. "Are you?" That's when I realized Kevin was no longer standing with us. I spun around frantically, searching the trail in both directions. He had simply vanished, as if he'd never existed at all. "Kevin!" Amanda screamed, her voice echoing strangely in the unnatural cold. "Kevin!" "He's collecting firewood," the Sarah thing said helpfully. "He'll be back soon, but he might be different." We waited in terror as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The shadows continued their delayed dance, and the cold grew so intense that ice crystals began forming on Bear's fur. Just as I was about to suggest we flee without Kevin, he emerged from the woods to our left, carrying an armload of deadfall branches. But it wasn't Kevin. Not really. He looked like Kevin. Same sandy hair, same athletic build, same hiking gear. But his eyes were wrong, too bright and too knowing. He moved with a strange, deliberate precision, like someone consciously controlling each muscle. And when he smiled at us, I could see too many teeth, arranged in patterns that didn't quite fit in a human mouth. "Found some good dry wood," he said in Kevin's voice, but the words came out slightly off rhythm as if he was learning to speak as he went. "Kevin," Sarah said carefully, "what's the capital of Illinois?" The thing wearing Kevin's face tilted its head. "Springfield," it replied, but there was a pause before the answer, as if it had to search for the information. "What did you call me when we were roommates in college?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another pause. "Mikey," it said finally. Kevin had never called me Mikey, ever. He'd always used my full name or occasionally Mike, but the nickname Mikey had been reserved for my sister. The Sarah doppelganger clapped her hands together in mock delight. "Oh, this is fun. A guessing game. Let's see how long it takes you to figure out which one is real." Amanda was backing away slowly, her camera finally raised. Through the viewfinder, she gasped. "There are dozens of them," she whispered. "Through the camera, I can see dozens of them in the trees, all wearing our faces." I grabbed Sarah's hand and Bear's leash. "Run!" We crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the trail entirely. Behind us, I could hear multiple voices calling our names. Some in Kevin's voice, some in voices I didn't recognize, and some in my own voice, which was perhaps the most terrifying of all. Bear led us with desperate determination, his natural instincts guiding us through terrain that seemed to shift and change as we moved. Trees that had been yards apart suddenly crowded together, forcing us to squeeze through gaps that shouldn't have existed. The ground beneath our feet alternated between solid earth and something that felt disturbingly organic, as if we were running across the surface of something vast and alive. "The car!" Sarah gasped as we ran. "We have to get to the car." But when we finally broke through the tree line into what should have been our campsite, we found only an empty clearing. Our tents, our supplies, our vehicle, everything was gone. Even the fire ring we'd built was absent, replaced by undisturbed forest floor covered in a thick layer of leaves that looked like they'd been accumulating for years. "This isn't right," Amanda whispered, turning in a slow circle. "This isn't the same place." The wrongness was overwhelming now. The trees were the wrong species. Instead of the oak and hickory we'd hiked through, we were surrounded by towering pines that shouldn't exist in this part of Illinois. The rock formations in the distance were different shapes, and the sky had taken on that sickly yellow tinge again, as if seen through old glass. Bear was barking frantically, not at any visible threat but at the ground itself. When I looked where he was indicating, I saw our footprints from earlier that day, but they were leading in the wrong direction, away from where we'd come from, toward where we were now standing. "Time loop," Sarah said suddenly, her scientific mind working even in terror. "We're caught in some kind of temporal displacement, the same events but slightly different each time." "That's impossible," Amanda protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "So are shadow people wearing our faces?" I pointed out grimly. A sound echoed through the trees, Kevin's voice but wrong, calling our names in a sing-song pattern that made my skin crawl. "Mike, Sarah, Amanda, come back. I found something interesting, something you need to see." We pressed deeper into the pines, following Bear's lead. The dog seemed to know where he was going, his terror replaced by grim determination. As we walked, I began to notice objects scattered on the forest floor. A hiking boot that looked like one of Kevin's, a water bottle with Amanda's distinctive stickers, fragments of what might have been our tent fabric. "How long have we been here?" Sarah asked suddenly. I checked my watch, but the face was blank. Not broken, just empty, as if time itself had ceased to exist in this place. Amanda's camera showed a timestamp of cycling endlessly without advancing. "I don't remember," I realized with growing horror. "I don't remember when we arrived or how long we've been walking." The Kevin thing's voice was getting closer, joined now by other voices. Sarah's voice, Amanda's voice, and most disturbingly, my own voice calling out from multiple directions. But the words were wrong, phrases none of us would ever say, delivered in tones that sounded like recordings played at the wrong speed. Bear suddenly stopped and began digging frantically at the base of a massive pine. Within seconds, he'd uncovered something that made my blood freeze. Kevin's wallet, but aged and weathered as if it had been buried for decades. "No," Amanda whispered, kneeling beside the hole Bear had excavated. "No, no, no." There were more objects buried there. Sarah's field notebook, but the pages were filled with handwriting none of us recognized. Diagrams of the forest that showed it as a vast spiral with no exit. Amanda's backup camera memory cards, their contents corrupted into patterns that looked almost like faces when viewed from a distance. And at the bottom of the impromptu grave, something that made me vomit into the pine needles. A driver's license with my photo and information, but listing a death date 3 years in the future. "We're not the first," Sarah said quietly, her scientific detachment cracking. "We're not the first version of ourselves to be here." The voices were almost upon us now, a chorus of our own words spoken by things that had learned to mimic us imperfectly. Through the trees, I could see figures moving, Sarah, Kevin, Amanda, and myself, but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, movements too fluid, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Bear began to growl, but it was different now. Not fear, but rage. Pure, protective fury. He placed himself between us and the approaching figures, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed sharper than I remembered. "They feed on temporal displacement," Sarah said suddenly, her mind still working even as terror consumed her rational thoughts. "They're not from here originally. They're stuck between moments, and they need us to create new moments to feed on." "How do we stop them?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Sarah looked at me with eyes full of desperate love and terrible knowledge. "One of us has to stay, voluntarily. That breaks the loop." "No," I said immediately. "Absolutely not." But Amanda was already walking toward the doppelgangers, her camera raised not in defense but in documentation. "I understand now," she called back to us. "Someone has to witness this. Someone has to record what happened here." "Amanda, don't!" Sarah screamed. But our friend was already among them, the false versions of ourselves surrounding her with their too wide smiles and wrong-angled movements. I watched in horror as they began to absorb her somehow. Not physically consuming her, but pulling something essential from her being, leaving behind a shell that looked like Amanda but moved with their same unnatural precision. The moment it was complete, the forest changed. The sickly yellow sky cleared to normal autumn afternoon light. The pines transformed back into familiar oak and hickory. Our campsite materialized around us as if it had never been gone, complete with our tents and supplies exactly as we'd left them. But Kevin was gone. The real Kevin. And in his place stood something wearing his face, something that smiled too much and blinked too little. "Great hike today," the Kevin thing said cheerfully as if nothing had happened. "Should we start dinner?" Bear launched himself at the imposter with a fury I'd never seen before. The German Shepherd's 90-pound body hit the entity square in the chest, and instead of falling, the thing unraveled. Like a poorly made puppet, it came apart at the seams, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. Angles that bent inward, colors that had no names, a writhing mass of intention and hunger that existed between the seconds of normal time. Sarah grabbed my hand and ran. Bear followed, and behind us I could hear the thing reassembling itself. Kevin's familiar voice calling out in confusion and hurt. "Mike! Sarah! Where are you going? What's wrong?" We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, Bear leading us along trails that seemed to exist only when we needed them. Finally, we collapsed near what I recognized as the legitimate trailhead where we'd parked the car. 3 days, or was it 3 years, ago. The vehicle was there, exactly as we'd left it, keys in my pocket right where they belonged. But as we approached, I noticed something that made my heart sink. There were only 2 seats. The back seat had never existed. According to the car's registration and insurance papers, it had always been a 2-seater sports car. Kevin had never existed, at least not in this version of reality. "Do you remember him?" I asked Sarah desperately as we sat in the car, engine running, heat blasting against the unseasonable cold that seemed to follow us. She was quiet for a long time, her dark eyes staring at something I couldn't see. "I remember someone," she said finally, "but I can't quite. The details keep slipping away." I felt the same thing happening to me. Kevin's face was becoming indistinct in my memory, his voice fading. By the time we reached the main highway, I could only remember that we'd had a 4th person with us, but not who they were or what they looked like. Amanda's absence was even more complete. Looking at my phone, there were no photos of her, no text messages, no evidence she'd ever existed. But there was a strange gap in my contacts, a space where someone should have been, and sometimes I caught myself looking over my shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. We drove in silence for hours, Bear panting nervously in the space that had once been a back seat. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw figures standing among the trees along the roadside, watching us leave. Some looked like Sarah, some like me, and some looked like people I'd never seen before but somehow knew intimately. The worst part wasn't the supernatural terror or the loss of our friends. The worst part was the growing certainty that this had all happened before, that we'd made this same escape, had this same conversation, felt this same mixture of relief and grief dozens of times, and each time we remembered a little less about what we'd lost. Sarah's field notebook, which had materialized in her backpack, contained pages of her handwriting documenting multiple versions of our camping trip, different details each time, but always ending the same way, with us driving away from the Shawnee Hills, missing pieces of ourselves we couldn't quite name. According to her notes, Kevin had been real in some versions. In others, it was Amanda who made it out with us. In one entry, there were names I didn't recognize, friends we'd apparently brought on previous iterations who had been consumed so completely that even the memories of memories had been erased. The notebook's final entry, written in handwriting that looked like mine but which I had no memory of creating, contained a single line repeated over and over. "The forest always collects its due." We never spoke about what happened in the Shawnee Hills, not directly, but sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake up calling out names I didn't recognize, and I would find myself setting the table for 4 instead of 2. Bear aged rapidly over the following months, his fur going gray and his eyes developing a haunted quality that reminded me of trauma survivors. The photographs Amanda had taken never materialized, but sometimes my phone would display images I didn't remember capturing. Blurry shots of trees that bent at impossible angles, shadows that fell upward, and in the background of several photos, groups of people who looked exactly like us but stood in poses we'd never made. 6 months later, I found myself researching the Shawnee National Forest online, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. According to official records, the area we'd camped in didn't exist. The coordinates from our GPS led to a section of forest that had been clear-cut for mining operations in the 1950s and never recovered. There were no hiking trails in that area, no camping sites, and certainly no rock formations like the ones we'd explored. But in the comment sections of obscure hiking forums, I found stories similar to ours, always involving groups of friends who went camping in remote areas of Illinois and came back different, missing people who had never existed, photographs of places that weren't on any map, and always the same advice repeated by anonymous users: don't go back. Whatever you do, don't try to go back. The temptation was overwhelming. Not to rescue our lost friends. By then, I could barely remember that anyone had been lost, but to understand what had happened to us. The gaps in our memories had become like infected wounds, painful and impossible to ignore. Sarah felt it too. I would catch her staring at maps of southern Illinois, her finger tracing routes to places that probably didn't exist. We left something there, she would say sometimes, something important. But Bear wouldn't let us go back. If we even mentioned driving south of Springfield, the normally gentle dog would become aggressive, blocking doorways and hiding car keys. He'd developed an uncanny ability to sense when we were even thinking about returning to the forest, responding with the same primal terror he'd shown that first day when he refused to leave the car. It was Bear who saved us, in the end. His animal instincts, unclouded by human rationalization and the terrible magnetism of unfinished business, kept us anchored to this version of reality. Because I know now that the forest was calling us back, trying to complete whatever process had been interrupted by our escape. The thing about temporal displacement, I've learned, is that it never really ends. You carry pieces of other timelines with you, fragments of possibilities and alternative selves. Sometimes I wake up with detailed memories of conversations with Kevin that never happened in this reality. Sometimes Sarah talks about Amanda as if she's still alive, then catches herself with a look of confusion and loss. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can hear voices calling from the direction of the Shawnee Hills. Familiar voices, speaking words and languages I don't recognize, promising answers to questions I've forgotten how to ask. We sold the house in Chicago and moved to Oregon, as far from Illinois as we could manage. But distance doesn't matter when dealing with forces that exist outside normal space and time. The forest has tendrils that stretch across the continent, moments of wrongness that can manifest anywhere. There are trees and shadows in the quiet spaces between human thoughts. Bear died on a Tuesday in March, 3 years after our camping trip. He passed peacefully in his sleep, but his final moments were troubled. He kept looking toward the east, toward Illinois, and whimpering in that same way he'd done that first day. His last act was to place himself between Sarah and me in the direction he sensed danger, even in death maintaining his protective vigil. We buried him in a pet cemetery outside Portland, under a headstone that read simply, "Bear, Guardian." But sometimes when the light hits his grave at sunset, I swear I can see him still standing there, ears perked and hackles raised, watching for things that shouldn't exist but do. The nightmares have gotten worse since Bear's death. Not because he was protecting us while alive, though he was, but because his passing seems to have opened a doorway that his presence had kept sealed. Sarah and I both dream of the forest now, of trails that lead in circles and clearings where multiple versions of ourselves sit around campfires that burn with impossible colors. In these dreams, Kevin and Amanda are always there, but they're wrong in ways that become more apparent the longer we observe them. They smile too much, laugh at things that aren't funny, and sometimes their faces slip, revealing the writhing darkness underneath. "You have to come back," Dream Kevin always says. "You have to finish what you started." "We miss you," Dream Amanda adds, her voice layered with harmonics that suggest multiple speakers. "It's lonely here without you." But it's the dreams where I see myself that are the most disturbing. Another Michael Williams, one who made different choices in that forest, who stayed behind instead of running. He sits by fires that cast no light and speaks in voices that echo from everywhere at once. "I volunteered," he tells me across the impossible distance between sleeping and waking. "I thought it would save everyone. But sacrifice doesn't work the way you think it does. It just creates new problems, new loops, new hungers that need feeding." I wake from these dreams with the taste of pine needles in my mouth and dirt under my fingernails, though I sleep in a bed 3 stories above street level in downtown Portland. Sarah wakes with similar evidence of nocturnal travel, burrs in her hair, scratches on her arms that form patterns neither of us can interpret. We've considered therapy, but how do you explain temporal displacement to someone trained in conventional psychology? How do you describe losing friends who may never have existed to someone who believes in linear time and consistent reality? Instead, we've developed our own rituals of protection. Salt lines around doorways, not because we believe in folklore, but because desperate people will try anything. Iron nails driven into window frames, mirrors positioned to reflect light into corners where shadows seem to linger too long. Most importantly, we've learned to trust animal instincts. The neighborhood cats avoid our apartment. Dogs cross the street rather than walk past our building. Even urban wildlife, rats, pigeons, insects, seem to sense something wrong about us, some contamination we carry from that place between moments. But the forest is patient. It can wait years, decades, generations for its due. Sometimes I receive emails from addresses that don't exist, containing photographs of camping sites that look familiar but wrong. Sometimes Sarah finds hiking gear in our closet that neither of us purchased, equipment designed for trips we never planned. The most disturbing evidence of the forest's continued influence comes in the form of other people's stories. Comments on social media posts about camping in Illinois, private messages from strangers who somehow found our contact information, phone calls in the middle of the night from numbers that don't exist. "You were there," they say. "You know what it's like. Please, tell me how to get them back." Always the same story, with minor variations. Groups of friends camping in remote areas. Someone goes missing and comes back wrong. Shadows that move independently. Time that flows in circles. And always, the desperate need to return, to fix what was broken, to complete what was started. I tell them what I told myself. Don't go back. Whatever you think you lost, it's not worth what you'll find. But I can hear in their voices the same compulsion Sarah and I struggle with daily, the magnetic pull of unfinished business and unanswered questions. Some of them stop calling after a while. Others call more frequently, their voices becoming increasingly desperate and strange. A few send photographs that make me delete my email account and change our phone numbers, images of forests that couldn't exist, and people who wear familiar faces but arrange them in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. The forest is growing. Not physically, though for all I know it might be doing that too, but temporally, spreading its influence across moments and memories, creating pockets of wrongness in places that should be safe. Sarah wants to have children. It's a normal desire, the kind of future planning that people in their 30s do, but I can't shake the terror that whatever we brought back from the Shawnee Hills might be hereditary, might manifest in a child who sees shadows that move wrong or hears voices calling from forests that exist in the spaces between thoughts. What if our children dream of Kevin and Amanda? What if they ask us about the friends we can barely remember losing? What if they inherit our compulsion to return to places that shouldn't exist? But perhaps that's the real horror, not the supernatural entities or temporal displacement, but the way trauma spreads, creating new victims in each generation, passing on fears and compulsions that have no rational basis but feel as real as heartbeats. We're leaving Portland next month, not because we think distance will help. We've learned that geography is meaningless when dealing with forces that exist outside normal space, but because staying in one place too long feels dangerous. The forest seems to have an easier time finding people who remain stationary, who develop routines and habits it can predict and exploit. So we'll keep moving, keep running from something that may not be chasing us but certainly isn't letting us go. We'll change our names again, find new jobs, make new friends. We'll probably lose in ways we won't quite be able to remember. And sometimes when we're driving through unfamiliar territory and see a forest that looks wrong in ways we can't articulate, we'll remember fragments of what we've lost. Not enough to make us turn back, but enough to remind us that some places exist specifically to take things from people, and some losses are so complete that even the grief gets stolen. The forest is patient, and the forest is hungry, and the forest always collects its due. We just hope we can keep running long enough to die of natural causes before it decides we've been free long enough. But even as I write this, I can feel the pull. South and east, toward Illinois, toward answers we don't really want and questions we're afraid to ask. Sarah feels it too. I can see it in her eyes when she thinks I'm not looking. The same desperate curiosity that's gotten countless others consumed by things that wear familiar faces and speak in borrowed voices. The forest is calling us home. And someday, despite everything we know about what waits there, we might just answer. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Shawnee National Forest, near the abandoned settlement of Robbs in Pope County, Illinois. I should have listened to the park ranger who warned us about the area. His weathered face had gone pale when Mark showed him our hiking route on the topographical map, tracing our finger along the dotted trail that would take us deep into the wilderness surrounding Bell Smith Springs. The ranger, his name tag read Kowalski, had shaken his head slowly. That section's been problematic, he'd said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We've had incidents. People go missing for days, then turn up confused, can't remember where they've been, and the ones who do remember, he'd trailed off, studying our eager faces. Well, they usually don't come back to hike again. But Mark Chen, my boyfriend of 3 years, had laughed it off. Come on, Jen, it's probably just people getting lost, city folks who don't know how to read a compass. He'd squeezed my shoulder with his usual confidence. We've been planning this anniversary trip for months. 3 days, just us in the wilderness. I'd wanted to believe him. Mark was an experienced hiker, methodical and prepared. He'd led our group through challenging terrain in Colorado and Montana without incident. His backpack was always perfectly organized, his gear meticulously maintained. If anyone could handle whatever Shawnee Forest threw at us, it was Mark. Our third companion was Sarah Rodriguez, my college roommate and closest friend. Sarah was the spontaneous one among us, always ready for adventure. But she also possessed an uncanny intuition about people and situations that had saved us from trouble more times than I could count. When she'd insisted on joining our romantic getaway, claiming she needed to reset her chakras in nature, Mark had been reluctant. But I was secretly grateful for her presence. The first day of hiking had been perfect. We'd started at the Bell Smith Springs trailhead in the early morning, the October air crisp and clean, painted with the brilliant reds and golds of autumn. The well-maintained trail wound through stands of oak and hickory, past limestone bluffs that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. We'd stopped frequently to photograph the natural rock bridges and crystalline pools that gave the springs their reputation. By late afternoon, we'd reached our planned campsite, a small clearing beside Lusk Creek, about 5 miles from the nearest road. The isolation was exactly what we'd wanted. No other hikers, no sounds of civilization, just the gentle murmur of running water and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mark had our camp set up with military precision. 3 individual tents arranged in a triangle around a central fire pit, bear canisters properly positioned downwind, water filtration system assembled near the creek. Sarah and I gathered firewood while he tested his GPS unit and checked our position on his paper map. "Signal's a bit weak out here," he'd commented, frowning at the device, "but we're right where we should be." That first night passed peacefully. We'd cooked a simple dinner over the fire, shared a bottle of wine Sarah had smuggled in her pack, and told stories late into the evening. The stars were magnificent. Thousands of pinpricks of light unmarred by any light pollution. I'd fallen asleep to the sound of Mark's gentle snoring and the creek's constant babble. I woke before dawn to absolute silence. The change was so abrupt, so complete, so that my eyes snapped open instantly. The creek had stopped flowing. No wind stirred the trees. Even the usual chorus of insects had ceased. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear something, anything, but the world had gone mute. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The other tents looked normal, undisturbed. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. But something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like the moment before a severe thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. "Mark?" I whispered. No response. I crawled out of my tent fully and walked the few steps to his. "Mark?" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The zipper on his tent was open. Not just unzipped, but torn. The fabric pulled apart in jagged lines as if something had clawed its way out, or in. Inside, his sleeping bag was empty but appeared to have been unzipped from within, just as if someone had gotten up normally. His gear was all there. Flashlight, knife, even his boots arranged neatly by the tent entrance. "Sarah," I called, spinning toward her tent, but I already knew what I'd find. The same torn zipper, the same empty sleeping bag unzipped from inside, the same eerie sense that someone had simply vanished. I stood alone in the clearing as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the canopy. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight. Even my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name from somewhere in the forest. Mark's voice. "Jennifer, Jennifer, help me!" Relief flooded through me. I grabbed my flashlight and crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, branches tearing at my clothes. "Mark, where are you?" "Over here, I'm hurt." I followed his voice deeper into the woods, but something nagged at me. Mark never called me Jennifer. It was always Jen, sometimes Jenny when he was being affectionate. Never the full formal name. I stopped running. "Mark," I called, "say something else." Silence stretched for long moments. Then, from a completely different direction, "Jennifer, Jennifer, help me." The exact same words, in the exact same tone, the exact same inflection, like a recording being played back. I backed away slowly, flashlight beam dancing wildly through the trees. Whatever was calling to me, it wasn't Mark. By full daylight, I'd returned to camp and tried to think rationally. Mark and Sarah could have gotten up early to explore, maybe fallen or gotten turned around. The rational explanation was usually the correct one. I would wait for them to return, then we'd figure out what happened. But hours passed with no sign of them. I tried Mark's cell phone number, knowing there was no signal but hoping anyway. Nothing. I checked the GPS unit he'd left behind. The screen showed only static, as if it couldn't determine our location. That's when I noticed the smell. It started subtly, just an odd sweetness in the air that didn't belong in a forest setting. As the morning progressed, it grew stronger, more cloying, like overripe fruit or flowers left too long in a vase. By noon, it had become nauseating, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach churn. The smell seemed to be coming from upstream. I followed Lusk Creek toward its source, trying to breathe through my mouth. The further I went, the stronger the odor became, until it was so overwhelming I had to fight the urge to retch. The creek itself had begun to look wrong. The water that had run clear and cold the day before now had an oily, iridescent sheen on its surface. I found them about a quarter-mile upstream. Mark and Sarah were standing waist-deep in a stagnant pool where the creek formed a natural dam. They were motionless, their backs to me, staring at something on the far shore I couldn't see. They'd been there long enough for their skin to take on a grayish, waterlogged appearance. "Mark! Sarah!" I called out, splashing into the shallow water at the pool's edge. They turned toward me in perfect unison, their movements mechanical and synchronized. Their faces made me stumble backward. Their eyes were completely black, not just the irises but the entire visible surface, as if they'd been filled with oil. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that revealed dark veins branching underneath. When they smiled, their teeth were stained brown, and something thick and dark leaked from the corners of their mouths. "Jennifer," they said in unison, their voices hollow and echoing strangely. "Come join us. The water feels wonderful." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a panicked animal, branches whipping at my face, thorns tearing my clothes. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not running, but walking with steady, measured steps that somehow kept pace with my frantic sprint. When I reached camp, I grabbed only the essentials: water, energy bars, my phone, and Mark's paper map. Everything else would have to stay. I had to get to the trailhead, had to reach civilization and get help. But when I looked at the map, my blood ran cold. The trail we'd followed to reach this campsite was no longer marked. The dotted line that had shown our route was simply gone, as if it had been erased. Worse, the creek we'd been camping beside wasn't shown on the map at all. According to the topographical survey, I was standing in the middle of solid forest with no water source for miles. I tried the GPS again, still static. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Jennifer." The voice came from just outside the clearing. Mark's voice, but wrong, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "Why did you run? We were having such a nice time." I could see them now, standing at the tree line. Mark and Sarah, but not Mark and Sarah. Their movements were too fluid, like they were floating rather than walking. The smell of decay preceded them, stronger than ever. "We've been waiting for you," Sarah's voice joined in, though her lips didn't quite match the words. "Waiting so long. It gets lonely here, Jennifer. So very lonely." I backed toward the opposite side of the clearing, map clutched in my hands. "You're not them. What did you do with my friends?" They tilted their heads in unison, like curious animals. "We are them," Mark Thing said. "We're just improved, enhanced, and we want to share that gift with you." "The water cleanses," Sarah Thing continued, "purifies, removes all the unnecessary things. Fear, pain, loneliness. Wouldn't you like that, Jennifer? To never feel alone again?" I turned and ran into the forest, choosing a direction at random. Behind me, their laughter followed, a sound like water gurgling down a drain. The forest had changed. Trees that should have been familiar now seemed alien, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The undergrowth was thicker, more tangled, as if it was actively trying to impede my progress. And everywhere, that sickly sweet smell of corruption. I stumbled through what felt like miles of wilderness, the canopy growing thicker above me until only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. That's when I realized I was being herded. Every time I tried to change direction, I'd encounter an impassable thicket or a steep ravine that forced me back onto a specific path. The forest was funneling me towards something, guiding me like a rat in a maze. The path eventually opened into another clearing, this one much larger than our campsite. In the center stood the ruins of what had once been a small settlement, rotting wooden foundations, a collapsed well, and the skeletal remains of a barn. This had to be what was left of Rob's, the abandoned community the ranger had mentioned. But the ruins weren't empty. Figures moved among the debris, dozens of them, all with the same waxy, translucent skin and oil-black eyes. Men, women, children, all standing motionless and watching me with predatory patience. They were dressed in clothing from different eras: modern hiking gear, 1980s windbreakers, vintage dresses from decades past. Some of the clothes were so old they were falling apart, revealing the grayish flesh beneath. "Welcome home, Jennifer," they said in unison, their voices creating a horrible chorus that echoed off the surrounding trees. In the front of the group stood Mark and Sarah, looking even more wrong than before. Their skin had taken on a greenish tint, and when they moved, water poured from their clothes as if they were still submerged. "This is our family," Markthing said, gesturing to the assembled figures. "Everyone who ever came to visit our beautiful forest. Everyone who ever tasted our special water." "You can't leave," Sarathing added, her voice disturbingly cheerful. "No one ever leaves. But that's okay, because once you join us, you won't want to." The circle of figures began to close in, moving with that same unsettling, fluid grace. I backed toward the collapsed well, frantically looking for any means of escape. That's when I saw him, a figure standing apart from the others, partially hidden behind the barn's remains. Unlike the others, his eyes were still human, still filled with desperate awareness. He was wearing a park ranger's uniform, and his name tag read Kowalski. He caught my gaze and mouthed a single word: "Run." Then he screamed, not words, but a raw, agonized sound that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. The assembled figures turned toward him, their synchronized movements breaking for the first time. I ran. Behind me, Kowalski's screams were cut short abruptly, followed by wet sounds I didn't want to identify. The other voices rose in harmony again, calling my name, promising peace and belonging and an end to loneliness. But I kept running, crashing through the forest with renewed desperation. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood. My lungs burned. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. The forest began to thin. Real sunlight, not the sickly filtered glow I'd been traveling under, broke through the canopy. And then, impossibly, I saw it. The gravel parking lot at the Bellsmith Springs trailhead, exactly where we'd left Mark's car 3 days ago. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them in the lock. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not just Mark and Sarah now, but all of them, their voices raised in that horrible harmony. The engine turned over on the third try. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, gravel spraying as I backed out of the parking space. Through the rearview mirror, I saw them emerge from the tree line, dozens of figures with black eyes and waxy skin, all standing perfectly still as they watched me drive away. I made it to the ranger station in record time, but when I tried to explain what had happened, the current ranger on duty, a young woman named Martinez, looked at me with barely concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, there's no record of anyone named Kowalski working here," she said gently, "and I have to tell you, we get reports like this sometimes. People go into the deep forest, get dehydrated, maybe eat the wrong berries. Hallucinations are more common than you'd think." "What about my friends?" I demanded. "Mark Chen and Sarah Rodriguez. They're missing." She dutifully took down their descriptions and promised to organize a search, but I could see in her eyes that she thought I was suffering from some kind of breakdown. The search teams found nothing. Our campsite appeared to have been abandoned for weeks, they said. No signs of recent habitation, no equipment, no traces of the 3 people who were supposed to have been there. Mark's car was exactly where I'd left it in the parking lot, but according to the ranger station's records, it had been there for over a month. The registration in the glove compartment was dated from the previous year. I tried to show them the photographs on my phone from our hike, but they were all corrupted. just digital static and distorted pixels that revealed nothing. The psychiatrist they referred me to was kind but firm. Acute stress reaction, he diagnosed, possibly triggered by relationship anxiety or fear of commitment. The mind, he explained, was capable of creating elaborate fantasies to avoid dealing with difficult emotional realities. Sometimes, he said, when we're afraid of losing the people we love, our subconscious creates scenarios where they're taken from us in ways that aren't our fault. It's a defense mechanism. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in those woods. And I know they're still out there, waiting by their tainted water, adding to their collection of the lost and lonely. Every missing person report from Shawnee National Forest, every hiker who disappears without a trace, every search that turns up nothing but abandoned campsites, they're all there now, standing in that ruined settlement, calling to the next group of visitors with voices that sound almost, but not quite, human. The thing that haunts me most isn't the memory of those black eyes or the smell of corruption. It's not even the way they moved or the wrongness of their too familiar faces. It's the fact that in those final moments before I ran from the clearing, when they were promising an end to loneliness and fear, when they offered me a place in their eternal family, part of me wanted to stay. That part of me whispers sometimes, late at night when the silence grows too heavy and the isolation becomes unbearable. It reminds me that Mark and Sarah are still there, waiting for me to come back. It tells me that I could join them, that I could belong to something larger than myself, that I would never have to face the world alone again. But I remember Kowalski's eyes, still human even after however long he'd been trapped there. I remember his final act of defiance, the scream that gave me the chance to escape. I moved away from Illinois the week after the incident, changed my name, started over in a place where the forests are young and the water runs clear. I tell people I'm from Ohio now, that I've never been hiking in my life. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and carries the scent of stagnant water, I can hear them calling. "Jennifer," they whisper across the miles. "Jennifer, come home." And the terrible thing is, I know that someday, when the loneliness becomes too much to bear, when the isolation finally breaks me down completely, I might just listen. My name is Kevin King, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Shawnee National Forest, deep in the southern tip of Illinois, where the ancient hills roll like sleeping giants and the trees whisper secrets older than memory. I should have listened to the locals in Herod when they warned us about the Hollow Man. Should have turned around when old Martha at the gas station grabbed my wrist with fingers like dry twigs and hissed, "Don't camp near Devil's Kitchen Lake after the new moon." Should have paid attention when my dog Rex, a loyal German shepherd who'd never shown fear of anything, whined and pressed against my legs the moment we stepped onto the trailhead. But I was running from my own demons then, trying to escape the suffocating weight of Sarah's death 6 months earlier. The cancer had taken her slowly, and I'd watched every agonizing day as the woman I loved dissolved before my eyes. Work friends meant well with their invitations to bars and their awkward attempts at comfort, but all I wanted was silence. Pure, empty silence where her ghost couldn't find me. So when my buddy Marcus Rodriguez suggested a 3-day camping trip to the most isolated part of Shawnee, I jumped at the chance. Marcus was good people, a fellow software engineer who understood the need to disconnect, literally and figuratively. We'd worked late nights together, shared countless cups of bitter office coffee, and he'd been one of the few who didn't treat me like broken glass after the funeral. "It'll be perfect, man," Marcus had said, spreading a topographical map across my kitchen table. "No cell towers, no Wi-Fi, just us and nature. Devil's Kitchen Lake is supposed to be pristine. Barely anyone goes there because the trail's so rough." I traced the route with my finger. 12 miles of increasingly difficult terrain through dense forest, past limestone bluffs and hidden caves, ending at a lake that didn't appear on most modern maps. The kind of place where you could scream and nobody would hear you, The irony wasn't lost on me later. We started the hike on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the leaves had turned the forest into a cathedral of gold and crimson. Rex bounded ahead, his black and tan coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight, occasionally circling back to check on us with that intelligent gaze that had always unnerved strangers. The first few miles were deceptively pleasant. Well-maintained trail, cheerful birdsong, the kind of postcard wilderness that makes city dwellers feel profound and connected to nature. Marcus kept up a steady stream of chatter about work, his girlfriend Amanda, plans for Thanksgiving. I let his voice wash over me like background noise, focusing on the rhythm of my boots against packed earth, the familiar weight of my backpack, the clean burn of exertion in my lungs. For the first time in months, the constant ache in my chest began to ease. That should have been my first warning. In the wild places of the world, peace is usually temporary. By late afternoon, the trail had deteriorated to little more than blazes carved into trees and the occasional cairn marking the way. The forest grew denser, older, with massive oaks and hickories that blocked out most of the sky. Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the branches, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay and rich earth. Rex's ears were constantly perked, his head swiveling at sounds I couldn't detect. "Jesus, it's quiet," Marcus said, his usual jovial tone subdued. He was right. The birdsong had faded to nothing, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. Even our footsteps sounded muffled, as if the forest were absorbing all sound. We made camp just as darkness fell, in a small clearing beside a stream that chuckled and gurgled with false cheerfulness. I'd brought a battery-powered lantern, but Marcus insisted on building a fire for atmosphere. The flames danced and flickered normally at first, casting familiar shadows that made the surrounding trees look like an audience of dark figures watching our little drama unfold. Rex refused to settle. He paced the perimeter of our camp with hackles raised, occasionally freezing to stare into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. When I called to him, he'd approach reluctantly, pressing against my leg for a moment before resuming his anxious patrol. "What's got into him?" Marcus asked, poking at the fire with a stick. The flames jumped higher, and for just a moment, so brief I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, they flickered blue. "Probably smells something," I said, scratching Rex behind the ears. His fur was damp with nervous sweat. "Bears, maybe, or coyotes." But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that made my skin crawl and my ancient hindbrain scream warnings I was too civilized to understand. We ate our freeze-dried meals in relative quiet, the earlier easy camaraderie replaced by a tension neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Every snap of wood in the fire made us both flinch. Every rustle in the underbrush caused Rex to growl low in his throat. And underneath it all was a sound I couldn't quite identify. A distant rhythm, like slow, deliberate footsteps, always just at the edge of hearing. "Tell me about the Hollow Man," I said suddenly, remembering the old woman's words. Marcus looked up from his meal, confused. "What Hollow Man?" "The woman at the gas station mentioned something about a Hollow Man. Said not to camp near the lake after the new moon. Kevin, we talked to that old guy behind the counter. There wasn't any woman." The spoon slipped from my fingers, clattering against my bowl. "Marcus, I specifically remember. Martha, her name was Martha. Gray hair, arthritis in her hands. She grabbed my wrist and... Dude, are you feeling okay? You've been acting weird since we left the main trail." His concern was genuine, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "Maybe the altitude is getting to you." But there was no altitude to speak of, and we both knew it. Shawnee's highest peaks barely topped 1,000 feet. I wanted to argue, to insist on my memory, but the words died in my throat. Because now that I thought about it, I couldn't quite picture the old woman's face. Only her words, echoing in my mind like a half-remembered dream. We went to bed early, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags while the fire burned down to glowing coals. Rex finally settled beside me, but his sleep was restless, punctuated by small whimpers and the occasional low growl. I lay awake, listening to the stream and the settling sounds of the forest, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. That's when I heard the whistling. It started soft and distant, a simple melody that seemed to drift through the trees like morning mist. Nothing threatening about it. Hell, it was almost beautiful. A folk tune, maybe, the kind of thing you might hear at a bluegrass festival. But there was something about the timing that made my skin crawl. The whistler would play a few bars, then pause for exactly 10 seconds, then resume, like a signal, or a lure. I nudged Marcus. "You hear that?" He mumbled something unintelligible and rolled over. The whistling continued, neither approaching nor receding, just maintaining that steady, hypnotic rhythm that seemed designed to draw you out of your tent and into the darkness. Rex was awake now, staring toward the sound with such intensity that I could feel his muscles trembling against my leg. The whistling paused again, and in that 10-second silence I heard something else, the soft whisper of bare feet through fallen leaves, moving in a slow circle around our camp. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows that seemed to shift and writhe just outside the light's reach. But the footsteps stopped abruptly, as if whatever was out there had frozen at the first touch of artificial illumination. The whistling resumed. Closer now. Close enough that I could make out individual notes, could hear the slight wet quality that suggested lips that hadn't spoken in a very long time. And underneath it, almost sub-audible, was a sound like wind through dry leaves, except there was no wind. I shook Marcus harder this time. "Marcus, wake up. Something's out there." He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "What? I don't hear anything." But the forest had gone completely silent. No whistling, no footsteps, not even the stream seemed to be flowing anymore. The only sound was our breathing and Rex's nervous panting. "There was someone walking around our camp," I whispered, "and whistling. You had to have heard it." Marcus grabbed his own flashlight and swept it across the clearing. Nothing. But when the beam passed over a particular tree about 20 feet away, Rex erupted in a frenzy of barking and snarling that made us both jump. "Easy, boy," I said, but my voice shook. Because in that brief moment when the light had illuminated the tree, I could have sworn I saw something tall and pale pressed against the trunk, watching us with eyes that reflected the light like mirrors. We spent the rest of the night taking turns on watch, though neither of us admitted we were scared. Men aren't supposed to be afraid of sounds in the dark, after all. We're supposed to be rational, logical, capable of explaining away anything that doesn't fit our understanding of the world. But when dawn finally broke, we discovered that our backpacks had been moved during the night. Not far, just a few feet from where we'd left them, but they'd been opened and carefully searched. Nothing was missing, but everything had been touched, examined, evaluated by hands we never heard. "Animals," Marcus said firmly, though his face was pale in the morning light. "Raccoons, probably, or bears looking for food." I wanted to believe him, but animals don't open zippers. Animals don't carefully fold items back the way they found them, and animals definitely don't leave handprints in the soft earth, prints that were almost human, but with fingers too long and joints that bent the wrong way. We should have turned back then. Should have packed up our gear and hiked back to civilization where things made sense and shadows stayed where they belonged. But I was still running from Sarah's ghost, and Marcus was too proud to admit his fear. So we broke camp and continued deeper into the forest, toward Devil's Kitchen Lake and whatever was waiting for us there. The second day's hike took us through terrain that seemed increasingly hostile. The trees pressed closer together, their branches forming a canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. The trail disappeared entirely, forcing us to navigate by compass and GPS, though both began behaving erratically as we descended into a valley that didn't appear on any of our maps. "This is wrong," Marcus said, staring at his GPS unit. According to the screen, we were somehow moving in circles, even though we'd been walking in a straight line for over an hour. The satellites must be getting interference from the canopy. But I was watching my compass needle spin slowly, unable to find magnetic north, and I knew it wasn't interference from overhead branches. We were in a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where technology failed and ancient things stirred in the shadows between the trees. Rex had grown increasingly agitated as the day wore on. He walked pressed against my leg, constantly looking over his shoulder, occasionally stopping to stare at something only he could see. His behavior was so unsettling that I found myself following his gaze, searching for threats in every shadow, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. That's when I started seeing them, glimpses of something pale moving between the trees, always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure it wasn't my imagination. A flash of white against dark bark, a suggestion of movement where nothing should have been moving, and always the feeling of being watched by eyes that had forgotten how to blink. "Marcus," I said during one of our rest stops, "do you feel like we're being followed?" He looked around nervously, then forced a laugh. "Come on, man. By what? The Blair Witch?" But I noticed he'd started glancing over his shoulder too, and his hand kept drifting to the knife clipped to his belt. Whatever was stalking us through the forest, we could both sense it, even if neither of us wanted to admit it. We reached Devil's Kitchen Lake just as the sun was setting, though lake was a generous description. It was more of a large pond, perhaps 50 yards across, fed by a waterfall that tumbled down a limestone cliff face. The water was black as old blood and perfectly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. Spanish moss draped the surrounding trees like burial shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay. "Beautiful," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something deeply unsettling about the place, a wrongness that made my skin crawl and my breathing shallow. Even the waterfall seemed muted, its cascade producing only a whisper instead of the roar it should have made. We made camp on the only level ground available, a small clearing perhaps 20 feet from the water's edge. I kept glancing at the lake's surface, expecting to see ripples or some sign of life beneath, but the water remained absolutely motionless. Not even insects disturbed its mirror-like perfection. Rex refused to drink from the lake, despite having hiked all day in the heat. When I tried to lead him to the water's edge, he planted his feet and whined, every muscle in his body tense with fear. Animals know things we've forgotten, instincts we've civilized out of ourselves. I should have listened to him. As we set up our tents, I noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the lake. Many of them bore scars, long, parallel gouges in the bark that looked almost like claw marks, but too regular, too deliberate, and they were all at the same height, about 7 feet off the ground, as if something tall had passed through the forest marking its territory. "Probably from deer rubbing their antlers," Marcus said when I pointed them out, but his explanation sounded forced. We both knew that deer didn't make marks like that. The fire proved difficult to start that evening. The wood seemed damp despite the dry weather, and the flames kept guttering out for no apparent reason. When we finally got it burning steadily, the smoke rose straight up into the still air until it reached a certain height, about 10 feet above our heads, where it suddenly dispersed as if hitting an invisible barrier. "Air inversion," Marcus said, but he was staring at the smoke with the same unease I felt. We ate our meal in relative silence, both of us stealing glances at the lake and the dark forest beyond. Rex had positioned himself between us and the water, facing outward like a sentinel. His hackles were raised, and every few minutes he'd emit a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. That's when we saw the lights. They started as tiny pinpricks in the darkness across the lake, no bigger than fireflies, but they moved with purpose, weaving between the trees in complex patterns that suggested intelligence. As we watched, more lights appeared, dozens of them creating an intricate dance that was both beautiful and deeply disturbing. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered. I had no answer. The lights pulsed and swirled, sometimes approaching the lake's edge before retreating into the forest. They made no sound, cast no reflection on the water's surface, and seemed to exist in their own dimension separate from our reality. And then, as abruptly as they'd appeared, they vanished. The forest plunged back into absolute darkness, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against our eardrums. Even the waterfall seemed to have stopped flowing. Rex pressed against my leg, trembling with barely contained terror. "We should go," I said. "Pack up and hike out in the dark. This place isn't right." Marcus nodded, but before either of us could move, the whistling started again. It came from across the lake this time, and the same haunting melody I'd heard the night before, but now I could make out words, or something that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. The tune was hypnotic, almost beautiful, and I found myself leaning forward to hear it better. That's when I noticed the water. The lake's perfect mirror surface had begun to ripple, but not from any wind or disturbance I could see. The ripples formed concentric circles that spread outward from the center, as if something was rising from the depths. And in the very center of those expanding rings, I caught a glimpse of something pale breaking the surface. "Kevin." Marcus's voice was tight with fear. "Kevin, look at Rex." My dog was staring across the lake with such intensity that his entire body vibrated. His ears were pinned back, his lips drawn back to expose his teeth, and a constant low whine escaped his throat. But what terrified me was his eyes. They were fixed on something I couldn't see, tracking movement across the water with the focus of a predator stalking prey. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming closer, not around the lake, but across it, as if whatever was making that sound could walk on water. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. "Kevin, do you see—" He never finished the sentence. The fire suddenly flared, shooting flames 15 feet into the air and bathing our campsite in harsh orange light. In that moment of illumination, I saw it, the thing standing in the middle of the lake. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched too long and joints that bent at angles that hurt to look at. Its skin was pale as bone, stretched tight over a frame that suggested starvation or something worse than starvation. But it was the face that made my blood freeze in my veins. It had no face. Where features should have been was smooth, unbroken skin, as if someone had erased everything that made it human. But somehow, despite having no eyes, no mouth, no nose, I knew it was looking directly at me. And the whistling, that beautiful, terrible melody, was coming from somewhere inside its hollow throat. The fire died back to normal proportions, and the thing was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. But the ripples continued spreading across the lake's surface, and the whistling echoed through the forest like the call of some ancient predator announcing its presence. "We're leaving," I said, scrambling to my feet. "Right now. Pack everything." Marcus didn't argue. We threw our gear into our backpacks with shaking hands, stamped out the fire, and prepared to flee into the darkness. But as I shouldered my pack, I realized Rex was no longer beside me. "Rex!" I called, panic edging my voice. "Rex, come!" A bark answered from the edge of the forest, sharp and urgent. I followed the sound with my flashlight beam and found him about 30 yards away, hackles raised and teeth bared at something I couldn't see. "Rex, here, now!" But instead of obeying, he did something that chilled me to the bone. He looked back at me with eyes that reflected the flashlight beam, and for just a moment, his expression was almost human, almost sad. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. "Rex!" I started after him, but Marcus grabbed my arm. "Kevin, no, we can't go in there. Not at night. Not with that thing." He was right. But leaving my dog felt like abandoning a family member. Rex had been with me for 5 years, had slept at the foot of my bed every night after Sarah died, had been the one constant in my life when everything else fell apart. But the forest beyond our campsite was impenetrable darkness, And somewhere in that darkness was the thing from the lake. We hiked out in the worst conditions imaginable. No moon, no starlight, navigating by flashlight and the faint glow of our GPS units. The forest seemed to actively resist our passage, with branches that caught at our clothes and roots that appeared under our feet without warning. Twice we lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack, wasting precious time and battery power. And all the while, we could hear the whistling. It followed us through the forest, sometimes close enough that I could feel breath on the back of my neck, sometimes distant and echoing. The melody never varied, never stopped, just that hypnotic tune that seemed designed to lead travelers astray. Once, when I glanced back, I saw a pale figure gliding between the trees about 50 yards behind us, keeping pace effortlessly despite our frantic hike. "Don't look back," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Just keep walking." But it was impossible not to look. The thing was there every time I turned around, always the same distance away, never approaching but never falling behind. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I thought I saw others. Tall, pale shapes moving through the darkness like ghosts of starved giants. We reached the main trail just as dawn was breaking, and suddenly the forest came alive with normal sounds. Birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. The whistling stopped abruptly, as if whatever had been following us couldn't cross some invisible boundary between the deep woods and the civilized world. I wanted to go back for Rex. Every instinct screamed at me to return to Devil's Kitchen Lake and find my dog, but Marcus physically restrained me when I tried to turn around. "He's gone, Kevin. Whatever that thing was, Rex is gone." I knew he was right, but the knowledge sat in my chest like a lead weight. Rex had saved us somehow. He'd drawn the thing's attention away from our camp, given us the chance to escape. And I'd abandoned him to whatever fate awaited in those dark woods. The drive home passed in silence. Marcus dropped me off at my house with promises to call, to check on me, to help me figure out what we'd experienced. But we both knew there was nothing to figure out. Some things can't be explained, only survived. That was 3 weeks ago. I've tried to return to Devil's Kitchen Lake twice since then. The first time, I couldn't find the trail. It was as if it had never existed. The second time, I managed to reach the valley, but the lake was gone. In its place was a dry depression filled with nothing but dead leaves and the lingering smell of stagnant water. I've researched the area extensively since then, looking for any mention of the Hollow Man or similar encounters. What I found makes my blood run cold. Dating back to the 1800s, there are dozens of reports of people disappearing near Devil's Kitchen Lake. Trappers, hunters, hikers, all vanishing without a trace. And in many of the reports, there are mentions of strange whistling heard in the forest, of pale figures seen moving between the trees. The local Cherokee had a name for the thing, Kituwa Envy, which roughly translates to Hollow Walker. According to their legends, it was once human, a medicine man who tried to commune with spirits beyond the veil and lost himself in the process. Now it wanders the deep places of the forest, calling to the living with its song, leading them into darkness where they join its eternal hunt. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a collar, Rex's collar, along with a photograph that made my hands shake so badly I dropped it. The picture showed Devil's Kitchen Lake at night, the water black and still as I remembered. But standing on the shore, barely visible in the darkness, were two figures. One was impossibly tall and pale, its featureless face turned toward the camera. The other was smaller, more familiar, with the distinctive silhouette of a German shepherd. Rex was sitting at the thing's feet like an obedient pet, his eyes reflecting the camera flash. But it was his expression that haunts me. Not the loyal, intelligent look I remembered, but something hollow and distant, as if whatever made him who he was had been drained away. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single word in spidery handwriting: soon. I've considered moving away from Illinois, starting fresh somewhere far from Shawnee National Forest and its dark secrets. But I know it wouldn't matter. The Hollow Man has my scent now, has tasted my fear and found it sweet. And somewhere in those ancient woods, my dog waits with eyes that no longer recognize the difference between master and prey. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the shadows seem deeper than they should be, I hear whistling coming from the darkness outside my windows. The same haunting melody that followed us through the forest, calling me back to finish what we started. I've stopped going outside after dark. I've installed motion sensors and security cameras, though they never capture anything useful, just pale shapes that blur and shift whenever they detect movement. My neighbors think I've lost my mind, and maybe I have. Maybe madness is the only rational response to seeing something that shouldn't exist. But I know the truth. The Hollow Man is patient, eternal, and it always collects what it believes belongs to it. The only question is whether it will come for me here, in the safety of civilization, or whether it will wait until I can no longer resist the call of its song. Either way, I know how this story ends. The only choice I have is whether to face it alone or take others with me into the darkness. Sometimes I think about Marcus, wonder if he hears the whistling too, but I haven't called him. Some burdens are too terrible to share, and some knowledge is too dangerous to spread. The nights are getting longer now, and winter is coming to Illinois. Soon the trees will be bare, the forest stripped of its concealing foliage. When that happens, when there's nowhere left to hide, I suspect the Hollow Man will finally make its move. Until then, I wait and listen, and try not to think about Rex standing guard in a place where dawn never comes, his hollow eyes reflecting lights that were never meant for the living world. The whistling is getting closer every night.